Section 35 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Jennifer Beckett Wood. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. The Big Trees of California, United States. C. F. Gordon-Cumming. At last we entered the true forest belt, and anything more beautiful you cannot conceive. We forgot our bumps and bruises in sheer delight. Oh, the loveliness of those pines and cedars, living or dead, for the dead trees are draped with the most exquisite golden green lichen, which hangs in festoons many yards in length, and is unlike any other moss or lichen I ever saw. I can compare it to nothing but gleams of sunshine in the dark forest. Then, too, how beautiful are the long arcades of stately columns, red, yellow, or brown, 200 feet in height, and straight as an arrow, losing themselves in their own crown of misty green foliage. And some standing solitary, dead and sun-bleached, telling of careless fires which burnt away their hearts, but could not make them fall. There are so many different pines and firs and cedars that as yet I can scarcely tell one from another. The whole air is scented with the breath of the forests, the aromatic fragrance of resin and of dried cones and pine needles baked by the hot sun. How it reminds me of Scotch firs! And the atmosphere is clear and crystalline, a medium which softens nothing and reveals the farthest distance in sharpest detail. Here and there we crossed deep gulches where streams, swollen to torrents by the melting snow on the upper hills, rushed down over great boulders and prostrate trees and the victims of the winter gales. Then we came to quiet glades in the forest, where the soft, lawn-like turf was all jewelled with flowers, and the sunlight trickled through the dripping boughs of the feathery Douglas pines, and the jolly little chipmunks played hide-and-seek among the great cedars, and chased one another to the very tops of the tall pitch pines, which stand like clusters of dark spires more than 200 feet in height. It was altogether lovely, but I think no one was sorry when we reached a turn in the road, where we descended from the high forest belt, and crossing a picturesque stream, Big Creek by name, we found ourselves in this comfortable ranch, which takes its name from one of the pioneers of the valley. We have spent a long day of delight in the most magnificent forest that it is possible to imagine, and I have realized an altogether new sensation, for I have seen the big trees of California, and have walked round about them, and inside their cavernous hollows, and have done homage as beseems a most reverent tree worshipper. They are wonderful. They are stupendous. But as to beauty, no. They shall never tempt me to swerve from my allegiance to my true tree love, the glorious deodara forest of the Himalayas. If size alone were to be considered, undoubtedly the sequoia stands preeminent, for today we have seen several trees at least 3 times as large as the biggest deodara in the cedar shades of Kunai. But for symmetry and grace and exquisitely harmonious lines, the God-given cedar of Himala stands alone, with its wide-spreading, twisted arms and velvety layers of foliage studded with pale green cones, its great red stem supporting a pyramid of green far more majestic than the diminutive crown of the big trees. So at first it was hard to realize that the California cedars are altogether justified in concentrating all their growing power in one steady upward direction, so intent on reaching heaven that they could not afford to throw out one kindly bough to right or left. They remind me of certain rigidly good Pharisees, devoid of all loving sympathies with their fellows, with no outstretched arms of kindly charity, only intent on regulating their own lives by strictest unvarying rule. Great towers of Babel they seem to me, straining upward towards the heaven which they will never reach. There is nothing lovable about a sequoia. It is so gigantic that I feel overawed by it, but all the time I am conscious that I am comparing it with the odd Dutch trees in a Noah's Ark, with a small tuft of foliage on the top of a large red stem, all out of proportion. And another unpleasant simile forces itself on my mind, namely a tall penguin, or one of the wingless birds of New Zealand, with feeble little flaps in place of wings, altogether disproportioned to their bodies. But this is merely an aside, lest you should suppose that each new land I visit wins my affections from earlier loves. The deodara forests must ever keep their place in my innermost heart. No sunlight can ever be so lovely as that which plays among their boughs. No sky so blue, no ice peak so glittering as those which there cleave the heaven. And I am sure that these poor wretched-looking digger Indians can never have the same interest for me as the wild Himalayan highlanders, the Paharis, who assemble at the little temples of carved cedar wood in the great forest sanctuary to offer their strange sacrifices and dance in mystic sunwise procession. Having said this much, I may now sing the praises of a newly found delight, for in truth these forests of the Sierras have a charm of their own which cannot be surpassed, in the amazing variety of beautiful pines, firs, and cedars of which they are composed. The white fir, the Douglas spruce, sugar pine, and pitch pine are the most abundant, and are scattered singly or in singularly picturesque groups all over the mountains hereabouts. But the big trees are only found in certain favoured spots, sheltered places watered by snow-fed streams at an average of from 5,000 to 7,000 feet above the sea. 8 distinct groves have been discovered, all growing in rich, deep vegetable mould on a foundation of powdered granite. Broad gaps lie between the principal groves, and it is observed that these invariably lie in the track of the great ice rivers, where the accumulation of powdered rock and gravel formed the earliest commencement of the soil, which by slow degrees became rich and deep and fertile. There is even reason to believe that these groves are pre-Adamite. A very average tree, only 23 feet in diameter, having been felled, its annual rings were counted by 3 different persons, whose calculations varied from 2,125 to 2,137, and this tree was by no means very aged-looking, probably not half the age of some of its big relations, one of which, on King's River, is 44 feet in diameter. Then again, some of the largest of these trees are lying prostrate on the ground, and in the ditches formed by their crash, trees have grown up of such a size and in such a position as to prove that the fallen giants have lain there for centuries, 1,000 years or more, and although partially embedded in the earth and surrounded by damp forest, their almost imperishable timber is as sound as if newly felled. So it appears that a sequoia may lie on damp earth for untold ages without showing any symptom of decay. Yet in the southern groves, huge prostrate trees are found quite rotten, apparently proving that they must have lain there for an incalculable period. Of the 8 groves aforesaid, the most northerly is Calaveras, and the most southerly is on the south fork of the Thule River. The others are the Stanislaus, the Merced and Crane Flat, the Mariposa, the Fresno, the Kings and Kaweah rivers, and the north fork of the Thule River. It is worthy of note that the more northerly groves are found at the lowest level, Calaveras being only 4,759 feet above the sea, while the Thule and Kaweah belts range over the Sierras at about 7,000 feet. The number of sequoias in the northern groves is reckoned to be as follows: Calaveras, 90 trees upwards of 15 feet in diameter; Stanislaus, or southern Calaveras Grove, distant 6 miles from North Calaveras, contains 1,380 trees over 1 foot in diameter, many of them being over 30 feet in diameter. Mariposa has its 600 sequoias, and the beautiful Fresno Grove, some miles from Mariposa, has 1,200. Merced has 50, and Tuolumne 30. The southern belts have not yet been fully explored, but are apparently the most extensive. The Mariposa Grove, where we have been today, is the only one which has been reserved by government as a park for the nation. It lies 5 miles from here. I should say rather there are 2 groves. The lower grove lies in a sheltered valley between 2 mountain spurs. The upper grove, as its name implies, occupies a higher level, 6,500 feet above the sea. We breakfasted very early, and by 6 a.m. were in the saddle. Capital, sure-footed ponies were provided for all who chose to ride. Some of the gentlemen preferred walking. From this house we had to ascend about 2,500 feet. As we gradually worked uphill through the coniferous belts, the trees seemed gradually to increase in size, so that the eye got accustomed by degrees, and when at length we actually reached the big tree grove, we scarcely realized that we were in the presence of the race of giants. Only when we occasionally halted at the base of a colossal pillar, somewhere about 80 feet in circumference and about 250 in height, and compared it with its neighbours, and above all with ourselves, poor insignificant pygmies, could we bring home to our minds a sense of its gigantic proportions. With all the reverence due to antiquity, we gazed on these Methuselahs of the forest, to whom a few centuries more or less in the record of their long lives are a trifle scarcely worth mentioning. But our admiration was more freely bestowed on the rising generation, the beautiful young trees, only about 500 or 600 years of age, and averaging 30 feet in circumference, while still younger trees, the mere children of about 100 years old, still retain the graceful habits of early youth and are very elegant in their growth, though, of course, none but mere babies bear the slightest resemblance to the tree as we know it on English lawns. It really is heartbreaking to see the havoc that has been done by careless fires. Very few of the older trees have escaped scatheless. Most of this damage has been done by Indians, who burn the scrub to scare the game, and the fire spreads to the trees, and there smoulders unheeded for weeks, till happily some chance extinguishes it. Many lords of the forest have thus been burnt out, and have at last fallen, and lie on the ground partly embedded, forming great tunnels, hollow from end to end, so that in several cases 2 horsemen can ride abreast inside the tree from, what was once, its base to its summit. We halted at the base of the grizzly giant, which well deserves its name, for it measures 93 feet in circumference, and looks so battered and weather-worn that it probably is about the most venerable tree in the forest. It is one of the most picturesque sequoias I have seen, just because it has broken through all the rules of symmetry, so rigidly observed by its well-conditioned, well-grown brethren, and instead of being a vast cinnamon-coloured column, with small boughs near the summit, it has taken a line of its own and thrown out several great branches, each about 6 feet in diameter, in other words, about as large as a fine old English beech tree. This poor old tree has a great hollow burned in it. I think the Indians must have used it as a kitchen, and our 6 ponies and mules were stabled in the hollow, a most picturesque group. It seems strange to see trees thus scorched and charred, with their insides clean burnt out, yet, on looking far, far overhead, to perceive them crowned with fresh blue-green, as if nothing ailed them, so great is their vitality. Benjamin Taylor says of such a one, "It did not know that it ought to be dead. The tides of life flowed so mightily up that majestic column." The Indians say that all other trees grow, but that the big trees are the special creation of the Great Spirit. So here too, you see, we have not tree worship, but something of the reverence accorded to the cedar in all lands. The Hebrew poet sang of the trees of the Lord, even the cedars of Lebanon, which he hath planted. And the hill tribes of northern India build a rudely carved temple beneath each specially magnificent clump of deodar to mark that they are God's trees, while in the sacred Sanskrit poems they are called Devadara or Devadaru, meaning the gift, the spouse, the word of God, but in any case denoting the sanctity of the tree. Whether these Californian Indians had any similar title for their big trees, I have failed to learn, but the name by which they are known to the civilized world is that of Sequoia, a half-caste Cherokee Indian who distinguished himself by inventing an alphabet and a written language for his tribe. It is a most ingenious alphabet consisting of 86 characters, each representing a syllable, and was so well adapted to its purpose that it was extensively used by the Indians before the white man had ever heard of it. Afterwards it was adopted by the missionaries, who started a printing press with types of this character and issued a newspaper for the Cherokee tribe by whom this singular alphabet is still used. When the learned botanist Hendrie had to find a suitable name for the lovely redwood cedars, he did honour to Sequoia by linking his memory forever with that of the evergreen forests of the Coast Range. And when afterwards these big trees of the same race were discovered on the Sierras, they of course were included under the same family name. Granite Crags, Edinburgh and London, 1884. End of section 35.
Section 36 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. Section 36, Gersoppa Falls, India, by W. M. Yool. These, the most famous falls in India, are situated on the Siravati or Sharavati River, which at that part of its course forms the boundary between the northwest corner of the native state of Mysore and the Bombay Presidency. The source of the river is in Mysore, halfway up Kodachadri, a hill about 5,000 feet high, near the famous old town of Nugur, once the seat of the Rajas of Mysore, where are still to be seen the ruins of an old fort and palace, and the walls of the town, 8 miles in circumference. The natives have a legend that the god Rama shot an arrow from his bow onto Kodachadri, and that the river sprang from the spot where the arrow fell, and hence the name Siravati, or Arrow-born. From its source, the river flows north for nearly 30 miles through the heart of the Western Ghats, and then turns west and flows down through the jungles of North Kanara to the Indian Ocean, another 30 miles. Shortly after taking the bend westwards, there comes the fall, which, on account of its height, is worthy of being reckoned amongst the great waterfalls of the world. Here, at one leap, the river falls 830 feet, and as, at the brink, it is about 400 yards wide, there are few, if any, falls in the world to match it. During the dry weather, the river comes over in 4 separate falls, but in the height of the monsoon, these become one, and as at that time the water is nearly 30 feet deep, the sight must be truly one of the world's wonders. It has been calculated that in flood time more horsepower is developed by the Gersoppa Falls than by Niagara. This, of course, is from the much greater height of Gersoppa, 830 feet against about 160 feet of Niagara, although the Niagara Falls are much wider and vaster in volume. The Kaicha Falls of the Essequibo in British Guyana are 741 feet sheer and 88 more of sloping cataract, but the river there is only 100 yards wide. At the Victoria Falls, the Zambezi, 1,000 yards wide, falls into an abyss 400 feet deep. My friend and I visited the falls in the end of September, about a month after the close of the monsoon, when there were 4 falls with plenty of water in them. The dry weather is the best for the sightseer, as, during the monsoon, the rain is so heavy and continuous that there would not be much pleasure in going there, although doubtless the sight would be grander and more awe-inspiring. The drainage area above the falls is 750 square miles, and the average yearly rainfall over this tract is 220 inches, nearly the whole of which falls in the 3 monsoon months, June, July, August, so it can be imagined what an enormous body of water comes down the river in these months. There is a bungalow for the use of visitors on the Bombay side of the river, about 100 yards away from the falls, built on the very brink of the precipice overhanging the gorge, through which the river flows, after taking the leap. So close to the edge is it that one could jump from the veranda sheer into the bed of the river, nearly 1,000 feet below. The 4 falls are called the Rajah, the Rora, the Rocket, and La Dame Blanche. The Rajah and Rora fall into a horseshoe-shaped cavern, while the Rocket and La Dame Blanche come over where the precipice is at right angles to the flow of the river, and are very beautiful falls. The Rajah comes over with a rush, shoots clear out from the rock, and falls one unbroken column of water, the whole 830 feet. The Rora comes rushing at an angle of 60 degrees down a huge furrow in the rock, for 150 feet, making a tremendous noise, then shoots right out into the middle of the horseshoe, and mingles its waters with those of the Rajah, about halfway down. The Rocket falls about 200 feet in sheer descent onto a huge knob of rock, where it is dashed into spray, which falls in beautiful smoky rings, supposed to resemble the rings formed by the bursting of rockets. La Dame Blanche, which my friend and I thought the most beautiful, resembles a snow-white muslin veil, falling in graceful folds and clothing the black precipice from head to foot. From the bungalow, a fine view is got of the Rocket and La Dame Blanche, and when the setting sun lights up these falls and forms numerous rainbows in the spray, it makes an indescribably beautiful scene. Here one is alone with nature, not a house or patch of cultivation anywhere. In front is the river, and all around are mountains and primeval forests, while the ceaseless roar of the waterfall adds a grandeur and a solemnity not easily described. Near where the Rajah goes over is a projecting rock called the Rajah's Rock, so named because one of the Rajahs of Nagur tried to build a small pagoda on it, but before being finished, it was washed away. The cutting in the rock for the foundation is still visible. To anyone who has a good head, a fine view of the horseshoe cavern can be had from this rock. The plan is to lie down on your stomach, crawl to the edge, and look over, when you can see straight down into the pool where the waters are boiling and seething, nearly 1,000 feet below. I took a few large stones to the edge and dropped them over, but they were lost to view long before they reached the bottom. It was quite an appreciable time, after my losing sight of them, before I observed the faint splash they made near the edge of the pool. In order to get to the foot of the falls, it is necessary to cross the river to the Mysore side, as there is no possibility of getting down to the Bombay side. About half a mile above the falls, there is a canoe, dug out of the trunk of a tree, which belongs to the native who looks after the bungalow, and ferries people across. A path has been made to enable visitors to get to the foot of the falls, and many fine views of all 4 are got while descending. The first half of the way down is fairly easy, but after that the track is a succession of steps down great boulders and across slabs of rock, rendered as slippery as ice by the constant spray. Ere my friend and I reached the bottom we were soaking wet, and realized when too late that we should have left the greater part of our clothes behind us. By going to the bottom, a much better idea of the immense height of the falls is got, and the climb up again helps still more to make one realize it. From the bungalow, the largest rocks in the bed of the river looked like sheep, but we found them to be huge boulders, 10 and 12 feet high and about 20 feet across. The falls seem to have become known to Europeans about 1840, but were very seldom visited in those days. Even now the number of visitors is small, as the nearest railway is 80 miles off, and there is no way of procuring supplies, with the exception of a little milk and a chicken to be had from the above-mentioned native. For a good many years there was great uncertainty about the height of the falls, but the question was finally set at rest by 2 naval lieutenants who plumbed them in 1857. The modus operandi was as follows. Their ship being off the coast near the mouth of the river, they got a cable transported to the falls and stretched it across the horseshoe, a distance of 74 yards. Having seen that the cable was properly secured at both ends, they got a cage fixed on, and one of them got into it and was hauled out until he was in the centre. From the cage he let down a sounding line with a buoy attached to the end of it, and found the depth to the surface of the water to be 830 feet. After satisfactorily accomplishing this feat, they proceeded to the foot of the falls and constructed a raft so as to plumb the pools, which they did, and found the greatest depth to be 132 feet. This was done near the end of the dry weather, when there was very little water in the river, and they were able to temporarily divert the Rajah and Rora into the Rocket, without doing which it would have been impossible to plumb the Horseshoe Pool, the deepest one, satisfactorily. About a mile from the bungalow is a hill called Nishani Gura, or Cairn Hill, from the top of which a magnificent view of the surrounding country is got. To the east lie the tablelands of the Deccan and Mysore, the flat expanse broken here and there by an occasional hill. North and south stretches the chain of the Ghauts, rising peak after peak as far as the eye can see, Kodachadri, where the Suravati rises, being very conspicuous, while to the west one looks down on the lowlands of jungle-covered Kanara, with glimpses of the river here and there, and beyond them gleams the Indian Ocean. The bungalow book, in which visitors inscribe their names, is very interesting reading. The records go back to 1840, and many travellers have written a record of what they did when there, while a few, inspired by the scene, have expressed their feelings in poetry, some of it well worth copying and preserving by any one who has seen the falls. Chambers Journal, London, 1896. End of section 36. Read by Elizabeth Copnall, Ventura, California, July 2024.
Section 37 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. Etna, by Alexandre Dumas. The word Etna, according to the savants, is a Phoenician word meaning the mouth of the furnace. The Phoenician language, as you see, was of the order of that one spoken of by Corviel to the bourgeois gentilhomme, which expressed many things in a few words. Many poets of antiquity pretend that it was the spot where Deucalion and Pyrrha took refuge during the flood. Upon this score, Signor Gemellaro, who was born at Nicolosi, may certainly claim the honour of having descended in a direct line from one of the first stones which they threw behind them. That would leave, as you see, the Montmorencies, the Rowans, and the Noailles far behind. Homer speaks of Etna, but he does not designate it a volcano. Pindar calls it one of the pillars of the sky. Thucydides mentions 3 great explosions from the epoch of the arrival of the Grecian colonies up to his own lifetime. Finally, there were 2 eruptions in the time of Denis. Then they followed so rapidly that only the most violent ones have been counted. Since the eruption of 1781, Etna has had some little desire to overthrow Sicily, but as these caprices have not had serious results, Etna is permitted to stand upon what it has accomplished. It is unique in its self-respect, and to maintain its eminence as a volcano. Of all these eruptions, one of the most terrible was that of 1669. As the eruption of 1669 started from Monte Rosso, and as Monte Rosso is only half a mile to the left of Nicolosi, we took our way, Jaden and I, to visit the crater, after having promised Signor Gemellaro to come to dinner with him. It must be understood beforehand that Etna regards itself too far above ordinary volcanoes to proceed in their fashion. Vesuvius, Stromboli, and even Hecla pour the lava over their craters, just as wine spills over a too-full glass. Etna does not give itself this trouble. Its craters is only a crater for show, which is content to play cup and ball with incandescent rocks large as ordinary houses, which one follows in their aerial ascension as one would follow a bomb issuing from a mortar. But during this time, the force of the eruption is really felt elsewhere. In reality, when Etna is at work, it throws up very simply upon its shoulders, at one place or another, a kind of boil about the size of Montmartre. Then this boil breaks, and out of it streams a river of lava which follows the slope, descends, burning or overturning everything that it finds before it, and ends by extinguishing itself in the sea. This method of procedure is the cause of Etna's being covered with a number of little craters which are formed like immense haymows. Each of these secondary volcanoes has its date and its own name, and all have occasioned in their time more or less noise and more or less ravage. We got astride of our mounts and started on our way upon a night that seemed to us of terrible darkness as we issued from a well-lighted room. But by degrees we began to distinguish the landscape, thanks to the light of the myriads of stars that sprinkled the sky. It seemed from the way in which our mules sank beneath us that we were crossing sand. Soon we entered the second region, or the forest region, that is, if the few scattered, poor and crooked trees merit the name of forest. We marched about 2 hours, confidently following the road our guide took us, or rather our mules, a road which, moreover, to judge by the eternal declivities and ascents, seemed terribly uneven. Already we realized the wisdom of Signor Gemellaro's provisions against the cold, and we wrapped ourselves in our hooded greatcoats a full hour before we arrived at a kind of roofless hovel where our mules stopped of themselves. We were at the Casa del Bosco, or della Neve, that is to say, the forest or the snow, names which it merits in either summer or winter. Our guide told us this was our halting place. Upon his invitation, we alighted and entered. We were halfway on the road to the Casa Inglese. During our halt, the sky was enriched by a crescent, which, although slender, gave us a little light. We continued to march a quarter of an hour longer between trees which became scarcer every 20 feet, and finally disappeared altogether. We were about to enter the third region of Etna, and we knew from the steps of the mules when they were passing over lava, crossing ashes, or when they trampled a kind of moss, the only vegetation that creeps up to this point. As for our eyes, they were of very little use, the sheen appearing to us more or less coloured, and that was all, for we could not distinguish a single detail in the midst of this darkness. However, in proportion as we ascended, the cold became more intense, and notwithstanding our cloaks, we were freezing. This change of temperature had checked conversation, and each of us, occupied in trying to keep himself warm, advanced in silence. I led the way, and if I could not see the ground on which we advanced, I could distinguish perfectly on our right the gigantic escarpments and the immense peaks that reared themselves like giants, and whose black silhouettes stood out boldly upon the deep blue of the sky. The further we advanced, the stranger and more fantastic shapes did these apparitions assume. We well understood that nature had not originally made these mountains as they are, and that it was a long contest that had ravaged them. We were upon the battlefield of the Titans. We clambered over Pelion, piled upon Ossa. All this was terrible, sombre, and majestic. I saw and I felt thoroughly the poetry of this nocturnal trip, and meanwhile I was so cold that I had not the courage to exchange a word with Jaden to ask him if all these visions were not the result of the weakness that I experienced, and if I were not dreaming. From time to time, strange and unfamiliar noises that did not resemble in the slightest degree any noises that one is accustomed to hear started from the bowels of the earth, and seemed to moan and wail like a living being. These noises had something so unexpectedly lugubrious and solemn about them that they made your blood run cold. We walked about 3/4 of an hour upon the steep and rough road. Then we found ourselves upon a slightly inclined slope where every now and then we crossed large patches of snow, and in which I was plunged up to my knees, and these finally became continuous. At length the dark vault of the sky began to pale, and a feeble twilight illumined the ground upon which we walked, bringing with it air even more icy than we had heretofore breathed. In this wan and uncertain light we perceived before us something resembling a house. We approached it, Jaden trotting upon his mule, and I coming as fast as possible. The guide pushed open the door, and we found ourselves in the Casa Inglese, built at the foot of the cone, for the great relief of travellers. It was 3:30 in the morning. Our guide reminded us that we had still 3/4 of an hour's climb at least, and if we wished to reach the top of the cone before sunrise, we had not a moment to lose. We left the Casa Inglese. We began to distinguish objects. All around us extended a vast field of snow, in the centre of which, making an angle of about 45 degrees, the cone of Etna arose. Above us all was in darkness. Towards the east only a light tint of opal coloured the sky on which the mountains of Calabria were vigorously outlined. At 100 feet from the Casa Inglese, we encountered the first waves of the lava plateau, whose black hue did not accord with the snow, in the midst of which it rose like a sombre island. We had to mount these solid waves, jumping from one to another, as I had done at Chamonix and the Mer de Glace, with this difference, that the sharp edges tore the leather of our shoes and cut our feet. This passage, which lasted 1/4 of an hour, was one of the most trying of the route. We were now about 1/3 of the way up, and we had only taken about half an hour to ascend 400 feet. The east brightened more and more. The fear of not arriving at the summit of the cone in time to see the sunrise lent us courage, and we started again with new enthusiasm, without pausing to look at the immense horizon, which widened beneath our feet at each step. But the further we advanced, the more the difficulties increased. At each step the slope became more abrupt, the earth more friable, and the air rarer. Soon on our right we began to hear subterranean roarings that attracted our attention. Our guide walked in front of us and led us to a fissure, from which came a great noise and a thick sulphurous smoke blown out by an interior current of air. Approaching the edges of this cleft, we saw at an unfathomable depth a bottom of incandescent and red liquid, and when we stamped our feet, the ground resounded in the distance like a drum. Happily, it was perfectly calm, for if the wind had blown this smoke over to our side, we should have been asphyxiated, for it is charged with terrible fumes of sulphur. We found ourselves opposite the crater, an immense well, 8 miles in circumference and 900 feet deep. The walls of this excavation were covered with scarified matter of sulphur and alum from top to bottom. In the bottom, as far as we could see at the distance from where we stood, there was some matter in eruption, and from the abyss there ascended a tenuous and tortuous smoke, resembling a gigantic serpent standing on his tail. The edges of the crater were cut out irregularly at a greater or less height. We were at one of the highest points. Our guide permitted us to look at this sight for a moment, holding us back, however, every now and then by our clothing when we approached too near the precipice, for the rock is so friable that it could easily give way beneath our feet, and we should repeat the joke of Empedocles. Then he asked us to remove ourselves about 20 feet from the crater to avoid all accidents and to look around us. The east, whose opal tints we had noticed when leaving the Casa Inglese, had changed to tender rose and was now inundated with the flames of the sun, whose disk we began to perceive above the mountains of Calabria. Upon the sides of these mountains of a dark and uniform blue, the towns and villages stood out like little white points. The Strait of Messina seemed a simple river, while to the right and left we saw the sea like an immense mirror. To the left, this mirror was spotted with several black dots. These black dots were the islands of the Lipariot archipelago. From time to time, one of these islands glimmered like an intermittent lighthouse. This was Stromboli, throwing out flames. In the west, everything was in darkness. The shadow of Etna cast itself all over Sicily. For 3/4 of an hour, the spectacle did nothing but gain in magnificence. I have seen the sun rise on Rigi and the Faulhorn, those two titans of Switzerland. Nothing is comparable to the view on Etna's summit. Calabria from Pizzo to Cape del Armi, the pass from Silla to Reggio, the Tyrrhenian Sea, the Ionian Sea, and the Aeolian Islands that seem within reach of your hand. To the right, Malta, floating on the horizon like a light mist. Around us, the whole of Sicily, seen from a bird's eye view, with its shores denticulated with capes, promontories, harbours, creeks and roads, its 15 cities and 300 villages, its mountains which seem like hills, its valleys which we know are furrowed with ploughs, its rivers which seem threads of silver, as in autumn they fall from the sky to the grasses of the meadows, and finally the immense roaring crater, full of flames and smoke, overhead heaven and at its feet hell. Such a spectacle made us forget fatigue, danger, and suffering. I admired it all without reservation, with my eyes and my soul. Never had God seemed so near and, consequently, so great. We remained there an hour, dominating all the old world of Homer, Virgil, Ovid, and Theocritus, without the idea of touching a pencil occurring to Jaden or myself, until it seemed to us that this picture had entered deeply into our hearts and remained graven there without the aid of ink or sketch. Then we threw a last glance over this horizon of 300 leagues, a sight seen once in a lifetime, and we began our descent. L'Espéranat, Impressions de Voyage, Paris, 1836. End of section 37. Read by Belinda McReynolds, Melbourne, 29th of April, 2024.
Section 38 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by BettyB. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. Pike's Peak and the Garden of the Gods, United States, by Isa Duffus Hardy. Colorado Springs, so called because the springs are at Manitou, 5 miles off, is a prairie town on a plateau 6,000 feet high, above which Pike's Peak stands sentinel, lifting his snow-capped head 14,000 feet into the clear depths of azure light, in which no fleck of cloud floats from morn to night and night to morn again. It is April, and not a drop of rain has fallen since the previous August. Mid-April, and not a leaf upon a tree. Not a flower or a bird seems to flourish here. No spring blossom scents the keen, fresh, life-giving air. No warbler soars high up into the stainless sapphire sky. The leafless cottonwood trees stand out white in the flood of sunlight, like trees of silver, their delicate bare branches forming a shining tangle of silvery network against that intense blue background. The place all looks bleak and barren to us. The wild grandeur of the mountains is unrelieved by the rich shadows of the pine forests, or the sunny green glints of meadows that soften alpine scenery. No flowery gardens, no smiling valleys, no velvet turf, no fragrant orchards, no luxuriant hedgerows, only the lonely mountain range, the crowning height of Pike's Peak, stern and solitary in his icy exultation, and the dead level of the prairie, stretching away eastward for hundreds and hundreds of miles, declining always at a gradual and imperceptible angle, till it slopes down to the very banks of the great Mississippi, over 1,000 miles away. But, although the spot does not seem altogether a paradise to us, it is a veritable Eden for consumptive invalids. Here they come to find again the lost angel of health, and seldom seek again unless they come too late. People live here who can live nowhere else. They long to return to their far-off homes, but home to them means death. They must live in this Colorado air or die. There is a snake in the grass of this Eden, where they have drunk the elixir of a new life, and its name is nostalgia. They long, some of them, for the snowy winters and flowery summers of their eastern homes. Others settle happily and contentedly in the endless sunshine of winterless, summerless Colorado. We rattled along cheerily in our light spring wagon over the smooth, fine roads, viewing the landscape from beneath the parasols which only partially shielded us from the blazing sun. Although the gentleman from Tennessee preserved a truly Western taciturnity, our driver beguiled the way with instructive and amusing converse. He pointed out to us, flourishing by the wayside, the soap weed, whose root is a perfect substitute for soap, and taught us to distinguish between the blue joint grass, yellow as hay in winter, but now taking on its hue of summer green, and the grayish neutral tinted buffalo grass, which is most succulent and nutritious, although its looks belie it, for a less tempting looking herb I have never had the pleasure of seeing. He also pointed out the dead body of a cow lying on a desolate plain, and informed us it would dry up to a mummy in no time. It was the effect of the air. Dead cattle speedily mummified and were no nuisance. Another dried up bovine skeleton bore witness to the truth of his assertion. We observed that the soil looked barren as desert sand, but he replied that it only required irrigation to be extremely fertile, showed us the irrigating ditches cut across the meadows, and described to us some of the marvelous productions of Colorado, a single cabbage head weighing 40 pounds, etc. He told us of the wondrous glories of the Arkansas Canyon and the Mount of the Holy Cross, which, alas, we were not to see, the roads thither being as yet rough traveling for ladies. He sang the praises of the matchless climate and the joys of the free, healthful life, far from the enervating and deteriorating influences of great cities. Indeed, it appeared from his conversation that nowhere on the face of the habitable globe could there be found any spot even remotely emulating the charms of Colorado, an opinion shared by every Coloradian with whom we held any intercourse. Our way then led up the Ute Pass, once in days not so far back frequented by the Ute Indians. Now, not an Indian is to be seen for miles. They have all been swept back onto a reservation, and the story of the Ute outbreak there of the past autumn is yet fresh in the minds of all. The Ute Pass is a winding, uphill road along the side of a deep canyon, the rocks here and there overhanging it threateningly, and affording a welcome shade from the piercing sun rays which follow us even here. The steep walls of the canyon are partly clothed and crowned with pine trees, and along its depths a rapid, sparkling stream bubbles and leaps over the rocks and boulders. Up the pass a wagon train is toiling on its way to the great new mining center, the giant baby city, Leadville, the youngest and most wonderful child of the prolific West. In this train we get entangled and move slowly along with it, wagons and cattle before us, wagons and cattle behind us, tourists, teamsters, miners, drivers, drovers, dogs, all huddled together in seemingly inextricable confusion. At the top of the pass we tourists turn, and while the wagon train plods on its slow way, we make the best of our way back down the hill, and take the road to the Garden of the Gods. Why the Garden of the Gods? I do not myself perceive the appropriateness of the appellation. There is not a flower in sight, only a few stunted shrubs and forlorn-looking thin trees. It is a natural enclosure of 50 or more acres, such as in Colorado is called a park, scattered with rocks of a rich red hue, and the wildest and most grotesque shapes imaginable. The giants might have made it their playground, and left their playthings around them. Here, tossed and flung about as if by a careless hand, lie the huge round boulders with which they played at ball. Here they amused themselves by balancing an immense mass of stone on a point so cunningly that it has stood there for centuries looking as if a touch would overturn it. There they have hewn a high rock into the rough semblance of a veiled woman. Here they have sculptured a man in a hat. There piled up a rude fortress, and there built a church. But the giants have deserted their playground ages ago, and trees have grown up between the fantastic formations they left. It is a strange, weird scene, and suggested to us forcibly that if we would view it right, we should go view it by the pale moonlight. How spectral those strange shapes would look in the gloom! What ghostly life would seem to breathe in them when the white moonbeams bathed their eerie outlines in her light! There is a something lost in the garden of the gods to us who only saw it with a flood of sunshine glowing on its ruddy rocks. Most of these have been christened according to their form: the nun, the Scotchman, the camel, and so on. Two huge walls of red and white stone, rising perpendicularly a sheer 300 feet, form the gate of the garden. Through this colossal and forever open gate we looked back with a sigh of farewell. Our glimpse of the scene seemed so brief, and we half fancied that of the veiled nun bowed her dark head in the sunshine in parting salute as we were whirled out of sight. Between Two Oceans, or Sketches of American Travel, London, 1884. End of section 38.
Section 39 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Sai Karthike Pentapati. Greatest Wonders of the World. Edited by Esther Singleton. The Great Geysir of Iceland by Sir Richard F. Burton. On the eastern slope of the Phractic Pile and extending round the north of the rock wall are the Hvers and Geysirs. Nothing can be meaner than their appearance, especially to the tourist who travels as usual from Reykjavik. Nothing more ridiculous than the contrast of this pin's point, this atom of periodic formation, with the gigantic theory which it was held to prove, Earth's central fire, the now obsolete dream of classical philosophers and celebrated academicians. Nothing more curious than the contrast between nature and art, between what we see in life and what we find in Travellers' illustrations. Sir John Stanley, perpetuated by Henderson, first gave consistence to the popular idea of that most wonderful fountain, the Great Geysir. Such is the character given to it by the late Sir Henry Holland, a traveller who belonged to the wonderbar epoch of English travel, still prevalent in Germany. From them we derive the vast background of Black Mountain, the single white shaft of 50 feet high, domed like the popular pine tree of Vesuvian smoke, the bouquet of water, the Prince of Wales feathers, double-plumed and triple-plumed, charged with stones, and the minor jets and side squirts of the foreground, where pygmies stand and extend the arm of illustration and the hand of marvel. On this little patch, however, we may still study the 7 forms of Geysir life. First is the baby still sleeping in the bosom of Mother Earth, the airy wreath escaping from the hot clay ground. Then comes the infant breathing strongly, and at times puking in the nurse's lap. Third is the child simmering with impatience, and fourth is the youth whose occupation is to boil over. The full-grown man is represented by the great gusher in the plenitude of its lusty power. Old age by the tranquil sleepy laug, and second childhood and death, mostly from diphtheria or quinsy, in the empty red pits strewed about the dwarf plain. Patheticism est, as the old scholiast exclaimed. It is hardly fair to enter deeply in the history of the Great Geysir, but a few words may be found useful. The silence of Ari Frodi, AD 1075, and of the Landnama box, so copious in its details, suggests that it did not exist in the 11th century, and the notice of Saxo Grammaticus in the preface to his History of Denmark proves that it had become known before the end of the 13th. Hence, it is generally assumed that the volcanic movements of AD 1294, which caused the disappearance of many hot springs, produced those now existing. Forbes clearly proved the growth of the tube by deposition of silex on the lips, a process which will end by sealing the spring. He placed its birth about 1060 years ago, which seems to be thoroughly reasonable, and thus for its manhood we have a period of about 6 centuries. In 1770, the Geysir sprouted 11 times a day. In 1814, it erupted every 6 hours, and in 1872, once between 2 and a week. Shefford vainly wasted 6 days, a French party 7, and there are legends of a wasted fortnight. Remains now only to walk over the ground, which divides itself into 4 separate patches, the extinct to the northwest, below and extending round the north of the Lagarfjall buttress, the Great Geysir, the Stroker and the Thikku to the south. In the first tract, earth is uniformly red, oxidized by air, not as in poetical Syria by the blood of Adonis. The hot, coarse bolus, or trachytic clay, soft and unctuous, astringent and adhering to the tongue, is deposited in horizontal layers, snowy white, yellow-white, ruddy, light blue, blue-grey, mauve, purple, violet, and pale green are the protean tints, often mixed and mottled, the effect of alum, sulfuric acid, and the decomposition of bisulfide of iron. The saucer of the Great Geysir is lined with geysirite, silica hydrate, beads or tubercules of grey-white silica. All the others want these fungi or coral-like ornaments. The dead and dying springs show only age-rusty moulds and broken-down piles, once chimneys and ovens resembling those of Reykjavik, now degraded and deformed to countless heaps of light and dark grey. Like most of the modern features, they drain to the cold rivulet on the east and eventually to the south. The most interesting feature is the Bleasy, which lies 160 feet north of the Great Geysir. This hot water pond, a grotto azzurra where cooking is mostly done, lies on a mound and runs in various directions. To the north, it forms a dwarf river valley flowing west of the Great Geysir. Eastward, it feeds a hole of bubbling water which trickles in a streak of white cinder to the eastern rivulet and a drip hole, apparently communicating underground with an ugly little boiler of grey-brown, scum-streaked, bubbling mud, foul-looking as a drain. The beautiful quiescent spring measures 40 feet by 15 and is of reniform or insect shape, the waist being represented by a natural arc of stone spanning the hot blue depths below the stony ledges which edge them with scallops and corrugations. Footnote: more exactly, the two divisions are each about 20 feet long. The smaller is 12 and the greater is 18 feet broad. The extreme depth is 30 feet. End footnote. Hence the name. This bridge is the blaze streaking a pony's face. Bleasy was not sealed by deposition of silex. It suddenly ceased to erupt in AD 1784, the year after the Skaptar convulsion, a fact which suggests the origin of the Geysirs. It is Mackenzie's cave of blue water, and travellers who have not enjoyed the lapis lazuli of the Capri Grotto indulge in raptures about its coloration. Northwest of the Bleasy and distant 200 feet is another ruin situated on a much higher plane and showing the remains of a large silicous mold. It steams, but the breath of life comes feebly and irregularly. This is probably the Roaring Geysir or the Old Geysir, which maps and plans place 80 yards from the Great Geysir. The Great Geysir was unpropitious to us, yet we worked hard to see one of its expiring efforts. An Englishman had set up a pyramid at the edge of the saucer, and we threw in several hundred weights, hoping that the silex acted upon by the excessive heat might take the effect of turf. The only effects were a borborygmus, which sounded somewhat like Bert, and a shiver as if the foul fiend had stirred the depths. The last eruption was described to us as only a large segment of the tube, not exceeding 6 feet in diameter. About midnight, the veteran suffered slightly from singultus. On Monday, the experts mispredicted that he would exhibit between 8 and 9 am, and at 1 am on Tuesday, there was a trace of second childhood life. After the usual eructation, a general bubble, half veiled in white vapor, rose like a gigantic glass shade from the still surface, and the troubled water trickled down the basin sides in miniature boiling cascades. There it flowed eastwards by a single waste channel, which presently forms a delta of two arms, the base being the cold, rapid, and brawling rivulet. The northern fork has a dwarf force, used as a douche, and the southern exceeds it in length, measuring some 350 paces. We were more fortunate with the irascible Stroker, whose name had been generally misinterpreted. Dillon calls it the piston or churning staff, and Barrow the shaker. It is simply the hand churn whose upright shaft is worked up and down. The churn-like column of water suggested the resemblance. This feature, perhaps the new Geysir of Sir John Stanley and Henderson, formerly erupted naturally, and had all the amiable eccentricity of youth. Now it must be teased or coaxed. Stanley gave it 130 feet of jet, or 36 higher than the Great Geysir, Henderson 50 to 80, Symington 100 to 150 feet, Bryson upwards of 100, and Baring Gould rather higher than the Geysir. We found it lying 275 feet, Mackenzie 131 yards, south of the Big Brother, of which it is a mean replica. The outer diameter of the saucer is only 7 feet, the inner about 18, and it is too well drained by its silex float channel even to remain full. The most interesting part to us was the fourth or southern tract. It is known as the Thiccuverar, thick calderous hot springs, perhaps in the sense opposed to thin or clear water. Amongst its eruptions flatum, the traveller feels that he is walking per ignis suppositos cineri doloso. There are at least 50 items in operation over this big lime kiln, some without drains, others shedding either by cinder-crusted channels eastward or westward through turf and humus to the swampy stream. It shows an immense variety from the infantine puff to the cold turf puddle, from jack-in-the-box to the cave of blue-green water surrounded by ledges of silex and opaline sinter, hydrate of silica, more or less broad. The infernal concert of flip-flopping, spluttering, welling, fizzing, grunting, rumbling and growling never ceases. The prevalent tints are green and white, but livelier hues are not wanting. One gusherling discharges red water, and there is a spring which spouts like an escape pipe, brown, high and strong. The little Geysir, which Mackenzie places 106 yards south of the Stroker, and which has been very churlish of late years, was once seen to throw up 10 to 12 feet of clean water, like the jet of a fireplay. The little Stroker of old travellers, a wonderfully amusing formation, which darts its waters in numerous diagonal columns every quarter of an hour, is a stufa or steam jet in the centre of the group, but it has long ceased its funning. Ultima Thule, or A Summer in Iceland, London and Edinburgh, 1875. End of section 39.
Section 40 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Shoesmith. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. The Rapids of the Danube, Turkey, by William Beattie. A short way below Grein commences the rapid called Greinersfall, where the river, suddenly contracting its channel and walled in by rugged precipices, assumes a new aspect of foam and agitation, while the roar of its downward course breaks deeper and harsher on the ear. This rugged defile is the immediate inlet to the Strudel and Wirbel, the Scylla and Charybdis of the Danube. This is by far the most interesting and remarkable region of the Danube. It is the fertile theme of many legends and traditions, and in pages of history and romance affords ample scope for marvelous incidents and striking details. not a villager but can relate 100 instances of disasters incurred and dangers overcome in this perilous navigation, of lives sacrificed and cargoes sunk while endeavoring to weather the 3 grand enemies of the passage, whirlpools, rocks, and robbers. But independently of these local traditions and the difficulties and dangers of the strait, the natural scenery which here arrests the eye is highly picturesque and even sublime. It is the admiration of all voyagers on the upper Danube, and keeps a firm hold of the memory long after other scenes and impressions have worn off. Between Ulm and the confines of the Ottoman Empire, there is only one other scene calculated to make anything like so forcible an impression on the tourist, and that is near the cataracts of the Iron Gate, a name familiar to every German reader. After descending the Grainerschwall, or rapids of the Grine above mentioned, the river rolls on for a considerable space, in a deep and almost tranquil volume, which, by contrast with the approaching turmoil, gives increased effect to its wild, stormy, and romantic features. At first, a hollow, subdued roar, like that of distant thunder, strikes the ear and rouses the traveler's attention. This increases every second, and the stir and activity which now prevail among the hands on board shows that additional force, vigilance, and caution are to be employed in the use of helm and oars. The water is now changed in its color, chafed into foam, and agitated like a seething cauldron. In front and in the center of the channel rises an abrupt, isolated, and colossal rock, fringed with wood, and crested with a mouldering tower, on the summit of which is planted a lofty cross, to which in the moment of danger the ancient boatmen were wont to address their prayers for deliverance. The first sight of this used to create no little excitement and apprehension on board. The master ordered strict silence to be observed. The steersman grasped the helm with a firm hand. The passengers moved aside so as to leave free space for the boatman, while the women and children were hurried into the cabin, there to await with feelings of no little anxiety the result of the enterprise. Every boatman with his head uncovered muttered a prayer to his favorite saint, and away dashed the barge through the tumbling breakers that seemed as if hurrying it on to inevitable destruction. All these preparations, joined by the wildness of the adjacent scenery, the terrific aspect of the rocks, and the tempestuous state of the water, were sufficient to produce a powerful sensation on the minds of even those who had been all their lives familiar with dangers, while the shadowy phantoms with which superstition had peopled it threw a deeper gloom over the whole scene. Now, however, these ceremonies are only cold and formal, for the danger being removed, the invocation of guardian saints has become less fervent, and the cross on the further isle, we fear, is often passed with little more than the common sign of obeisance. Within the last 50 years the rocks in the bed of the river have been blasted, and the former obstructions so greatly diminished that in the present day the Strudel and Verbel present no other dangers than what may be caused by the ignorance or negligence of boatmen, so that the tourist may contemplate the scene without alarm, and enjoy in all its native grandeur the picture here offered to his eye and imagination. Frowning o'er the weltering flood, castled rock and waving wood, monkish cell and robber's hold, rugged as in days of old, from precipices stern and grey, guard the dark and dreaded way. The tourist who has happily escaped the perils of the Strudel Rapids has still to encounter, in his descent, the whirlpool of the Verbel, which is distant from the former little more than 500 fathoms. Between the two perils of this passage in the Danube there is a remarkable similarity, magna componere parvis, with that of the Faro of Messina, where the hereditary terrors of Scylla and Charybdis still intimidate the pilot as he struggles to maintain a clear course through the strait. There in foaming whirls Charybdis curls, loud Scylla rolls to larboard. In that howling gulf, with the dog and wolf deep moored tonight with her living freight, that goodly ship is harbored. The cause of the whirlpool is evident at first sight. In the center of the stream is an island called the Hanstein, about 150 yards long by 50 in breadth, consisting of primitive rock, and dividing the river, which at this point descends with tremendous force, into the two separate channels of the Hosgang and the Strudel already mentioned. In its progress to this point, it meets with that portion of the river which runs smoothly along the northern shore, and breaking it into 1,000 eddies, forms the Verbel. This has the appearance of a series of foaming circles, each deepening as it approaches the center, and caused by the two opposite streams rushing violently against each other. That such is the real cause of the Verbal is sufficiently proved by the fact that in the great autumnal inundation of 1787, when the flood ran so high as to cover the Hanstein, the Verbal, to the astonishment of the oldest boatmen and natives of the country, had entirely disappeared. For the obstacle being thus counteracted by the depth of the flood, and the stream being now unbroken by the rock, rushed down in one continuous volume, without exhibiting any of those gyratory motions which characterize the Verbal. The sombre and mysterious aspects of the place, its wild scenery, and the frequent accidents which occurred in the passage, invested it with awe and terror. But above all, the superstitions of the time, a belief in the marvelous and the credulity of the boatmen, made the navigation of the Strudel and the Verbal a theme of the wildest romance. At night, sounds that were heard far above the roar of the Danube issued from every ruin. Magical lights flashed through their loopholes and casements. Festivals were held in the long deserted halls. Maskers glided from room to room. Waltzers maddened to the strains of an infernal orchestra. Armed sentinels paraded the battlements, while at intervals the clash of arms, the neighing of steeds, and the shrieks of unearthly combatants smote fitfully on the boatman's ear. But the tower in which these scenes were most fearfully enacted was that on the Longstone, commonly called the Devil's Tower, as it well deserved to be, for here, in close communion with his master, resided the Black Monk, whose office it was to exhibit false lights and landmarks along the gulf, so as to decoy the vessels into the whirlpool or dash them against the rocks. Returning to Orsova, we re-embarked in boats provided by the navigation company, and proceeded to encounter the perils of the Eisentor, the iron gate of the Danube, which is so apt to be associated in the stranger's imagination with something of real personal risk and adventure. The iron gate, we conjecture, is some narrow, dark, and gloomy defile, through which the water, hemmed in by stupendous cliffs, and iron-bound, as we say, foams and bellows and dashes over a channel of rocks, every one of which, when it cannot drag you into its own whirlpool, is sure to drive you upon some of its neighbors, which with another rude shove that makes your bark stagger and reel sends you smack upon a third. But the gate? Why, the gate is nothing more or less than other gates, the outlet, and I dare say we shall be very glad when we are let out quietly. Very narrow at that point, suppose? Very. You have seen an iron gate? To be sure I have. Well, I'm glad of that, because you can more readily imagine what the iron gate of the Danube is. Yes, and I am all impatience to see it. But what if it should be locked when we arrive? Why, in that case we should feel a little awkward. Should we have to wait long? Only till we got the key, although we might have to send to Constantinople for it. Constantinople? Well, here's a pretty situation. I wish I had gone by the cart. You certainly had your choice, and might have done so. The company provide both wagon and water conveyance to Gladova, but I dare say we shall find the gate open. I hope we shall. And as for the rocks and all that, why, we got over the Verbal and Strudel and Islay and 20 others, and suppose we get over this too. It's only the gate that puzzles me. The handbook says not a word about that. Quite unpardonable, such an omission. Write to the publisher. By this time we were ready to shoot the rapids, and certainly at first appearance the enterprise was by no means inviting. The water, however, was in good volume at the time, and although chafed and fretted by 1,000 cross-curling eddies which tossed their crests angrily against our bark, we kept our course with tolerable steadiness to the left and without apparent danger, unless it might have arisen from sheer ignorance or want of precaution. More towards the center of the channel there would certainly have been some risk, for there the river is tortured and split into numberless small threads of foam by the rocky spikes which line the channel and literally tear the water into shreds as it sweeps rapidly over them. And these, more than the declivity itself, are what present a more formidable appearance in the descent. But when the river is full they are not much observed, although well known by their effects in the cross eddies, through which, from the channel for boats being always intricate and irregular, it demands more caution and experience to steer. The entire length of these rapids is rather more than 1,700 yards, with a perpendicular fall of nearly 1 yard in every 300, and a velocity of from 3 to 5 yards in every second. Boats, nevertheless, are seen from time to time slowly ascending, close under the left bank of the river, dragged by teams of oxen. "But the iron gate?" said an anxious voice, again addressing his fellow tourist. "I see nothing like a gate. But of course we have to pass the gorge first." "We have passed both," said his friend, "and here is Gladova." "Passed both? Tell that to the Marines. I know a gorge when I see it, and a gate when I see it, but as yet we've passed neither." "Why, there they are," reiterated the other, pointing to the stern. "Those white, frothing eddies you see dancing in the distance, those are the iron gate. And very luckily we found the key." Footnote: At the Iron Gate, the Danube quits the Austrian dominions and enters those of Turkey. The country on the south continues for some time mountainous, then hilly, and by degrees sinks into a plain. On the north is the great level of Wallachia. In its course towards the Black Sea, the Danube divides, frequently forming numerous islands, especially below Silistria. Its width, where undivided, now averages from 1,500 to 2,000 yards, its depth above 20 feet. Before reaching its mouth, several large rivers flow into it, as the Alt, Sereth, and Pruth. On its junction with the last mentioned river, it divides into several branches, which do not unite again, and it at last terminates its long course by issuing through 7 several mouths into the Black Sea. End of footnote. The inquirer now joined heartily in the laugh, and taking another view of the gate, we glided smoothly down to the little straggling, thatch-clad village of Gladova. The Danube, London, 1844. End of section 40.
Section 41 of The Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information, or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Piotr. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. The Mammoth Cave, by Bayard Taylor. There was no outbreathing from the regions below as we stood at the entrance to the cave, the upper atmosphere having precisely the same temperature. We advanced in single file down the main avenue, which, from the increased number of lamps, showed with greater distinctness than on our first trip. Without pausing at any of the objects of interest on the road, we marched to the giant's coffin, crawled through the hole behind it, passed the deserted chambers, and reached the bottomless pit, the limit of our journey in this direction the previous day. Beyond the pit we entered upon new ground. After passing from under its Moorish dome, the ceiling became low and the path sinuous and rough. I could only walk by stooping considerably, and it is necessary to keep a sharp lookout to avoid striking your head against the transverse jumps of rock. This passage is aptly called the Valley of Humiliation. It breaches off to the right into another passage called Pensico Avenue, which contains some curious stalactitic formations similar to the Gothic gallery. We did not explore it, but turned to the left and entered an extremely narrow, winding passage, which meanders through the solid rock. It is called Fat Man's Misery, and anyone whose body is more than 18 inches in breadth will have trouble to get through. The largest man who ever passed it weighed 260 pounds, and any gentleman weighing more than that must leave the best part of the cave unexplored. None of us came within the scope of prohibition. Nature, it seems, is opposed to corpulence, and after 5 minutes' twisting, we emerged into a spacious hall called the Great Relief. Its continuation forms an avenue which leads into Bandits' Hall, a wild, rugged vault, the bottom of which is heaped with huge rocks that have fallen from above. All this part of the cave is rich in striking and picturesque effects, and presents a more rude and irregular character than anything we had yet seen. At the end of Bandits' Hall is the meat room, where a fine collection of limestone hams and shoulders are suspended from the ceiling, as in a smoke-house. The resemblance, which is really curious, is entirely owing to the action of the water. The air now grew perceptibly damp, and a few more steps brought us to the entrance of River Hall. Here the ceiling not only becomes loftier, but the floor gradually slopes away before you, and you look down into the vast depths and uncertain darkness, and question yourself if the Grecian fable be not indeed true. While I paused on the brink of these fresh mysteries, the others of the party had gone ahead under the charge of Matt. Stephen, who remained with me, proposed that we should descend to the banks of the Styx and see them crossing the river upon the natural bridge. We stood on the brink of the black, silent water. The arch of the portal was scarcely visible in the obscurity far above us. Now, as far below, I saw the twinkle of a distant lamp, then another and another. "Is it possible," I asked, "that they have descended so much further?" "You forget," said Stephen, "that you are looking into the river and see their reflected images. Stoop a little, and you will find that they are high above the water." I stooped and looked under an arch, and saw the slow procession of golden points of light passing over the gulf under the eaves of a great cliff. But another procession, quite as distinct, passed on below until the last lamp disappeared, and all was darkness again. 5 minutes more, and the roughest and most slippery scrambling brought us to the banks of the Lethe River, where we found the rest of the party. The river had risen since the previous day, and was at the most inconvenient stage possible. A part of the river walk was overflowed, yet not deep enough to float the boats. Matt waded out and turned the craft, which was moored to a projecting rock, as near to us as the water would allow, after which he and Stephen carried us one by one upon their shoulders and deposited us in it. It was a rude, square scow, well plastered with river mud. Boards were laid across for the ladies. The rest of us took our seats on the muddy gunwales, the guides plied their paddles, and we were afloat on Lethe. After a ferrage of about 100 yards, we landed on a bank of soft mud beside a small arm of the river, which had overflowed the usual path. We sank to our ankles in the moist, tenacious soil, floundering laboriously along until we were brought to a halt by Echo River, the third and last stream. This again is divided into 3 or 4 arms, which, meandering away under low arches, finally unite. As we stood on the wet rocks, peering down into the black translucence of the silent, mysterious water, sounds, first distant, then near, then distant again, stole to us from under the groined vaults of rock. First the dip of many oars, then a dull, muffled peal rumbling away like the echoes of thunder, then a voice marvellously sweet, but presently joined by others, sweeter still, taking up the dying notes ere they faded into silence, and prolonging them through remoter chambers. The full, mellow strains rose until they seemed sung at our very ears, then relapsed like ebbing waves, to wander off into solitary halls, then approached again and receded like lost spirits seeking here and there for an outlet from the world of darkness. Or was it a chorus of angels come on some errand of pity and mercy to visit the Stygian shores? As the heavenly harmonies thickened, we saw a gleam on the water, and presently a clear light, floating above its mirrored counterfeit, swept into sight. It was no angel, but Stephen, whose single voice had been multiplied into that enchanting chorus. The whole party embarked in 2 small boats, and after a last voyage of about 200 yards, were landed beyond the waters and free to explore the wonderful avenues of that new world of which Stephen is the Columbus. The river hall here terminates, and the passages are broken and irregular for a short distance. A few minutes of rough travel brought us to a large circular hall with a vaulted ceiling, from the centre of which poured a cascade of crystal water, striking upon a slant side of a large reclining boulder, and finally disappearing through a funnel-shaped pit in the floor. It sparkled like a shower of pearls in the light of our lamps, as we clustered around the brink of the pit to drink from the stores gathered in those natural bowls, which seemed to have been hollowed out for the uses of the invisible gnomes. Beyond Cascade Hall commences Silliman's Avenue, a passage about 20 feet wide, 40 or 50 in height, and a mile and a half in length. Our lamps were replenished, and we entered El Gor, which is by far the most picturesque avenue in the cave. It is a narrow, lofty passage meandering through the heart of a mass of horizontal strata of limestone, the broken edges of which assume the most remarkable forms. Now there are rows of broad, flat shelves overhanging your head. Now you sweep around the stern of some mighty vessel with its rudder set hard to starboard. Now you enter a little vestibule with friezes and mouldings of almost Doric symmetry and simplicity, and now you wind away into a Cretan labyrinth, most uncouth and fantastic, whereof the Minotaur would be a proper inhabitant. It is a continual succession of surprises, and to the appreciative visitor, of raptures. The pass is somewhat more than a mile and a half in length, and terminates in a curious knot or entanglement of passages leading to 2 or more tiers of avenues. We were now, according to Stephen's promises, on the threshold of wonders. Before proceeding further, we stopped to drink from a fine sulphur spring which fills a natural basin in the bottom of a niche made on purpose to contain it. We then climbed a perpendicular ladder, passing through a hole in the ceiling barely large enough to admit our bodies, and found ourselves at the entrance of a narrow, lofty passage leading upwards. When all had made the ascent, the guides exultingly lifted our lamps and directed our eyes to the rocks overhanging the aperture. There was the first wonder, truly. Clusters of grapes, gleaming with blue and violet tints through the water which trickled over them, hung from the cliffs, while a stout vine, springing from the base and climbing nearly to the top, seemed to support them. Hundreds on hundreds of bunches, clustering so thickly as to conceal the leaves, hang forever ripe and forever unplucked in that marvellous vintage of the subterranean world, for whose hand shall squeeze the black infernal wine from grapes that grow beyond Lethe? Mounting for a short distance, this new avenue suddenly turned to the left, widened, and became level. The ceiling is low, but beautifully vaulted, and Washington's Hall, which we soon reached, is circular and upwards of 100 feet in diameter. This is the usual dining room of parties who go beyond the rivers. Nearly 5 hours had now elapsed since we entered the cave, and 5 hours spent in that bracing, stimulating atmosphere might well justify the longing glances which we cast upon the basket carried by the guides. Mr. Miller had foreseen our appetites, and there were stores of venison, biscuit, ham, and pastry, more than sufficient for all. We made our midday, or rather midnight meal sitting, like the nymph who wrought Excalibur, upon the hidden bases of the hills, buried far below the green Kentucky forests, far below the forgotten sunshine. For in the cave you forget that there is an outer world somewhere above you. The hours have no meaning. Time ceases to be. No thought of labor, no sense of responsibility, no twinge of conscience intrudes to suggest the existence you have left. You walk in some limbo beyond the confines of actual life, yet no nearer the world of spirits. For my part, I could not shake off the impression that I was wandering on the outside of Uranus or Neptune, or some planet still more deeply buried in the frontier darkness of our solar system. Washington Hall marks the commencement of Elindo Avenue, a straight hall about 60 feet wide, 20 in height, and 2 miles long. It is completely encrusted from end to end with crystallizations of gypsum, white as snow. This is the crowning marvel of the cave, the pride and the boast of the guides. Their satisfaction is no less than yours, as they lead you through the diamond grottos, the gardens of sparry efflorescence, and the gleaming vaults of this magical avenue. We first entered the snowball room, where the gnome children, in their sports, have peppered the grey walls and ceiling with thousands of snow-white projecting discs, so perfect in their fragile beauty that they seem ready to melt away under the blaze of your lamp. Then commences Cleveland's cabinet, a gallery of crystals, the richness and variety of which bewilder you. It is a subterranean conservatory, filled with the flowers of all the zones, for there are few blossoms expanding on the upper earth, but are mimicked in these gardens of darkness. I cannot lead you from niche to niche and from room to room, examining in detail the enchanted groves. They are all so rich and so wonderful that the memory does not attempt to retain them. Sometimes the hard limestone rock is changed into a pasture of white roses. Sometimes it is starred with opening daisies. The sunflowers spread their flat discs and rayed leaves. The feathery chalices of the cactus hang from the clefts. The night-blooming cereus opens securely her snowy cup, for the morning never comes to close it. The tulip is here a virgin, and knows not that her sisters above are clothed in the scarlet of shame. In many places the ceiling is covered with a mammary crystallization, as if a myriad bubbles were rising beneath its glittering surface. Even on this jewelled soil, which sparkles all around you, grow the lilies and roses, singly overhead, but clustering together towards the base of the vault, where they give place to long, snowy, pendulous cactus flowers, which droop like a fringe around diamonded niches. Here you see the passion flower, with its curiously curved pistils, there an iris with its lanceolate leaves, and again bunches of celery with stalks wide and tender enough for a fairy's dinner. There are occasional patches of gypsum, tinged of a deep amber colour by the presence of iron. Through the whole length of the avenue there is no cessation of the wondrous work. The pale rock blooms burst forth everywhere, crowding on each other until the brittle sprays cannot bear their weight, and they fall to the floor. The slow, silent efflorescence still goes on, as it has done for ages in that buried tropic. What mostly struck me in my underground travels was the evidence of design which I found everywhere. Why should the forms of the earth's outer crust, her flowers and fruits, the very heaven itself which spans her, be so wonderfully reproduced? What laws shape the blossoms and the foliage of that vast crystalline garden? There seemed to be something more than the accidental combinations of a blind chance in what I saw, some evidence of an informing and directing will. In the secret caverns, the agencies which produced their wonders have been at work for thousands of years, perhaps thousands of ages, fashioning the starry splendours in the wombs of darkness with as exquisite a grace, as true an instinct of beauty as in the palm or the lily, which are moulded by the hands of the sun. What power is it which lies behind the mere chemistry of nature, impregnating her atoms with such subtle laws of symmetry? What but divine will, which first gave her being, and which is never weary of multiplying for man the lessons of his infinite wisdom? At the end of Elindo Avenue the floor sinks, then ascends, and is at last blocked up by a huge pile of large, loose rocks. When we had reached the floor, the roof of the avenue suddenly lifted and expanded, and the summit of the Rocky Mountains, as they are called, leaned against a void waste of darkness. We climbed to the summit about 100 feet above, whence we looked down into an awful gulf, spanned far above our heads by a hollow dome of rock. The form of this gigantic hole was nearly elliptical. It was probably 150 feet in height by 500 in length, the ends terminating near the roof in the cavernous mouths of other avenues. The guides partly descended till the hill, and here kindled a brilliant Bengal light, which disclosed more clearly the form of the hole, but I thought it more impressive, as its stupendous proportions were first dimly revealed by the light of our lamps. Stephen, who discovered this place, gave it the name of the Dismal Hollow. Scrambling along the ridge of the Rocky Mountains, we gained the entrance to the cavern opening on the left, which we followed for about 200 yards, when it terminated in a lofty circular dome called Croghan's Hall. The floor on one side dropped suddenly into a deep pit, around which were several cushions of stalagmite, answering to short stalactites hanging from the ceiling far above. At the extremity of the hall was a sort of recess formed by stalactitic pillars. The wall behind it was a mass of veined alabaster. "Here," said Stephen, "is your Ultima Thule. This is the end of the Mammoth cave, 9 miles from daylight. But I doubt whether there is really any end of the cave any more than an end of the earth. Notwithstanding the ground we had traversed, we had left many vast avenues unexplored, and a careful search would no doubt lead to further discoveries. We retraced our steps slowly along Elindo Avenue, stopping every few minutes to take a last look at the bowers of fairy blossoms. After reaching Washington's Hall, we noticed that the air was no longer still, but was flowing fresh and cool in our faces. Stephen observed it also, and said, "There has been a heavy rain outside." Entering the pass of El Gore, again at Martha's Vineyard, we walked rapidly forward, without making a halt, to its termination at Silliman's Avenue. The distance is reckoned by the guides at a little more than a mile and a half, and we were just 40 minutes in walking it. We several times felt fatigue, especially when passing the rougher parts of the cave, but the sensation always passed away in some accustomable manner, leaving us fresh and buoyant. The crossing of the rivers was accomplished with some labour, but without accident. I accompanied Stephen on his return through the second arch of Echo River. As I sat alone in the silent, transparent darkness of the mysterious stream, I could hear the tones of my boatman's voice gliding down the caverns like a wave, flowing more and more faintly, until its vibrations were too weak to move the ear. Thus, as he sang, there were frequently 3 or 4 notes, each distinctly audible, floating away at different degrees of remoteness. At the last arch there was only a space of 18 inches between the water and the rock. We lay down on our backs in the muddy bottom of the boat, and squeezed through to the middle branch of Echo River, where we found the rest of the party, who had gone round through Purgatory. After again threading Fat Man's Misery, passing the bottomless pit and the deserted chambers, we at last emerged into the main avenue at the Giant's Coffin. It was 6 o'clock, and we had been 10 hours in the cave. When we heard the tinkling drops of the little cascade over the entrance, I looked up and saw a patch of deep tender blue set in the darkness. In the midst of it twinkled a white star, whiter and more dazzling than any star I ever saw before. I paused and drank at the trough under the waterfall, for, like the fountain of Trevi at Rome, it may be that those who drink there shall return again. When we ascended to the level of the upper world, we found that the fierce tornado had passed along during the day. Trees had been torn up by the roots and hurled down in all directions. Stunning thunders had jarred the air, and the wet earth was fairly paved with leaves cut off by the heavy hail. Yet we, buried in the heart of the hills, had heard no sound, nor felt the slightest tremor in the air. The stars were all in their places as I walked back to the hotel. I had been 12 hours underground, in which I had walked about 24 miles. I had lost a day with its joyous morning, its fervid moon, its tempest, and its angry sunset of crimson and gold, but I had gained an age in a strange and hitherto unknown world, an age of wonderful experience, and an exhaustless store of sublime and lovely memories. At Home and Abroad, New York, 1864. End of section 41.
Section 42 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. Stromboli, Sicily, Alexandre Dumas. As we advanced, Stromboli became more and more distinct every moment, and through the clear evening air we could perceive every detail. This mountain is formed exactly like a haymow, its summit being surmounted by a peak. It is from this summit that the smoke escapes, and at intervals of a quarter of an hour a flame. During the daytime this flame does not apparently exist, being lost in the light of the sun. But when evening comes and the orient begins to darken, this flame becomes visible, and you can see it dart forth from the midst of the smoke, which it colors, and fall again in jets of lava. Towards 7 o'clock we reached Stromboli. Unfortunately, the port is in the east, and we came from the west, so that we had to coast along the whole length of the island, where the lava descended down a sharp slope into the sea. For a breadth of 20 paces at its summit and 150 at its base, the mountain at this point is covered with cinders, and all vegetation is burned. The captain was correct in his predictions. We arrived half an hour after the port had been closed. All we could say to make them open to us was lost eloquence. However, the entire population of Stromboli had run to the shore. Our Speranare was a frequent visitor to this harbor, and our sailors were well known in the island. It was in Stromboli that Aeolus held bound the Luctantis Ventos Tempestatis Sonoris. Without doubt, at the time of the Song of Aeneas, and when Stromboli was called Strongyle, the island was not known for what it really is, and hid within its depths the boiling masses and periodical ejaculations which make this volcano the most obliging one in the world. In sooth, you know what to expect from Stromboli. It is not like Vesuvius or Etna, which make the traveler wait sometimes 3, 5, or even 10 years for a poor little eruption. I have been told that this is doubtless owing to the position they hold in the hierarchy of fire-vomiting mountains, a hierarchy that permits them to be aristocratic at their own pleasure. This is true enough, and we must not take it amiss if Stromboli allows her social position to be assailed an instant, and to have understood that it is only a little toy volcano to which one would not pay the slightest attention if it made itself so ridiculous as to put on airs. Moreover, it did not keep us waiting. After scarcely 5 minutes' expectation, a heavy rumbling was heard, a detonation resembling 20 cannon fired in succession, and a long jet of flame leaped into the air and fell again in a shower of lava. A part of this shower fell again into the crater of the volcano, while the other, rolling down the slope, hurried like a brooklet of flame to extinguish itself hissing into the sea. 10 minutes later, the same phenomenon was repeated, and at every succeeding 10 minutes throughout the night. I admit that this was one of the most curious nights I ever spent in my life. Neither Jaden nor I could tear ourselves away from this terrible and magnificent spectacle. There were such detonations that the very atmosphere seemed excited, and you imagined the whole island trembling like a frightened child. It was only Malone that these fireworks put into a state of exultation impossible to describe. He wanted to jump into the water every moment to devour the burning lava, which sometimes fell 10 feet from us, like a meteor precipitating itself into the sea. As for our boatswain, he was so accustomed to the spectacle that, after asking if we needed anything, and upon our reply in the negative, he retired between decks, and neither the lightnings that illuminated the air nor the thunders that shook it had power to disturb his slumbers. We stayed here until 2 o'clock. Finally, overcome with fatigue and sleep, we decided to retire to our cabin. As for my lord, nothing would persuade him to do as we did, and he stayed all night on deck, growling and barking at the volcano. We woke in the morning at the first movement of the Speranare. With the return of daylight, the mountain lost all its fantastic appearance. We constantly heard the detonations, but the flame had become invisible, and that burning lava stream of the night was confused in the day with the reddish ashes over which it rolls. 10 minutes more, and we were again in port. This time we had no difficulty in entering. Pietro and Giovanni got off with us. They wished to accompany us on our ascent. We entered not an inn, there are none in Stromboli, but a house whose proprietors were related to our captain. As it would not have been prudent to have started on our way fasting, Giovanni asked permission of our hosts to make breakfast for us, while Pietro went to hunt for guides. A permission not only accorded to us with much grace, but our host also went out and came back in a few moments with the most beautiful grapes and figs that he could find. After we had finished our breakfast, Pietro arrived with 2 Stromboliotes, who consented, in consideration of half a piastra each, to serve as guides. It was already nearly 8 o'clock. To avoid a climb in the greatest heat of the day, we started off immediately. The top of Stromboli is only 12 or 1,500 feet above the level of the sea, but its slope is so sharp that you cannot climb in a direct manner, but must zigzag eternally. At first, on leaving the village, the road was easy enough. It rose in the midst of those vines laden with grapes that make the commerce of the island, and from which the fruit hangs in such great quantity that any one may help himself to all he wants without asking the permission of the owner. However, upon leaving the region of the vineyards, we found no more roads, and we had to walk at random, looking for the best ground and the easiest slopes. Despite all these precautions, there came a moment when we were obliged to scramble on all fours. There was nothing to do but climb up, but this place once passed, I vowed that on turning around and seeing it, jutting almost perpendicularly over the sea, I asked in terror how we could ever descend. Our guides then said that we would come down by another road. That pacified me a little. Those who, like myself, are unhappy enough to have vertigo when they see a chasm below their feet will understand my question, and still more the importance I attach to it. This breakneck spot passed, the ascent became easier for a quarter of an hour, but soon we came to a place which at the first glance seemed impassable. It was a perfectly sharp-pointed angle that formed the opening of the first volcano, and part of which was cut out perpendicularly upon the crater, while the other fell with so sharp a slope to the sea that it seemed to me if I should fall perpendicularly on the other side, I could not help rolling from top to bottom. Even Jaden, who ordinarily climbs like a chamois, without ever troubling about the difficulties of the ground, stopped short when we came to this passage, asking if there was not some way to avoid it. As you may imagine, this was impossible. The crater of Stromboli is formed like a vast funnel, from the bottom and the center of which is an opening through which a man can enter a little way, and which communicates with the internal furnace of the mountain. It is through this opening, resembling the mouth of a cannon, that the shower of projectiles darts forth, which, falling again into the crater, sweeps with it down the inclined slope of stones the cinders and lava that, rolling to the bottom, block up that funnel. Then the volcano seems to gather its forces together for several minutes, compressed as it is by the stoppage of its valve, but after a moment its smoke trembles like a breath. You hear a deep roaring run through the hollow sides of the mountain. Then the cannonade bursts forth again, throwing up 200 feet above the summit new stones and new lava, which, falling back and closing the orifice of the passage anew, prepare for a new outburst. Seen from where we were, that is, from top to bottom, this spectacle was superb and terrifying. At each internal convulsion that the mountain essayed, you felt it tremble beneath you, and it seemed as if it would burst asunder. Then came the explosion, similar to a gigantic tree of flame and smoke that shook its leaves of lava. Finally we reached the extremity of this new lake of Sodom, and we found ourselves in an oasis of vines, pomegranates, and olives. We had not the courage to go any farther. We lay down in the grass, and our guides brought us an armful of grapes and a hatful of figs. It was marvelous to us, but there was not the smallest drop of water for our poor milord to drink, and we perceived him devouring the skin of the figs and grapes. We gave him part of our repast, and for the first, and probably for the last, time in his life he dined off figs and grapes. I have often a desire to put myself in the place of milord and write his memoirs, as Hoffmann wrote those of his cat, Muir. I am convinced that he must have had, seen from the canine point of view, I beg the Academy's pardon for the expression, extremely new impressions of the people and countries that he has visited. A quarter of an hour after this halt we were in the village, writing upon our tablets this judicious observation, that the volcanoes follow but do not resemble each other. We were nearly frozen when ascending Etna, and we were nearly roasted when descending Stromboli. Jaden and I each extended a hand towards the mountain and swore that notwithstanding Vesuvius, Stromboli was the last volcano whose acquaintance we would make. Le Capitaine Arena, Impressions de Voyage, Paris, 1836. End of section 42.
Section 43 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Shoesmith. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. The High Woods, by Charles Kingsley. The High Woods, South America, by Charles Kingsley. In the primeval forest, looking upon that which my teachers and masters, Humboldt, Spix, Martius, Schomburg, Waterton, Bates, Wallace, Gosse, and the rest, had looked already, with far wiser eyes than mine, comprehending somewhat at least of its wonders, while I could only stare in ignorance. There was, actually, then such a sight to be seen on earth, and it was not less but far more wonderful than they had said. My first feeling on entering the high woods was helplessness, confusion, awe, all but terror. One is afraid, at first, to venture in 50 yards. Without a compass or the landmark of some opening to or from which he can look, a man must be lost in the first 10 minutes. Such a sameness is there in the infinite variety. That sameness and variety make it impossible to give any general sketch of a forest. Once inside, you cannot see the woods for the trees. You can only wander on as far as you dare, letting each object impress itself on your mind as it may, and carrying away a confused recollection of innumerable perpendicular lines, all straining upwards in fierce competition towards the light food far above. And next on a green cloud, or rather mist, which hovers round your head and rises, thickening and thickening to an unknown height. The upward lines are of every possible thickness, and of almost every possible hue. What leaves they bear, being for the most part on the tips of the twigs, give a scattered, mist-like appearance to the under foliage. For the first moment, therefore, the forest seems more open than an English wood. But try to walk through it, and 10 steps undeceive you. Around your knees are probably mamures, with creeping stems and fan-shaped leaves, something like those of a young coconut palm. You try to brush among them, and are caught up instantly by a string or wire belonging to some other plant. You look up and round, and then you find that the air is full of wires, that you are hung up in a network of fine branches belonging to 6 different sorts of young trees, and intertwined with as many different species of slender creepers. You thought at your first glance, among the tree stems, that you were looking through open air. You find that you are looking through a labyrinth of wire rigging, and must use the cutlass right and left at every 5 steps. You push on into a bed of strong sedge-like sclarias, with cutting edges to their leaves. It is well for you if they are only 3 and not 6 feet high. In the midst of them you run against a horizontal stick, triangular, rounded, smooth, green. You take a glance along it, right and left, and see no end to it either way, but gradually discover that it is the leaf stalk of a young cocorite palm. The leaf is 25 feet long, and springs from a huge ostrich plume, which is sprawling out of the ground and up above your head a few yards off. You cut the leaf stalk through right and left, and walk on, to be stopped suddenly, for you get so confused by the multitude of objects that you never see anything till you run against it, by a gray, lichen-covered bar as thick as your ankle. You follow it up with your eye, and find it entwine itself with 3 or 4 other bars, and roll over with them in great knots and festoons and loops 20 feet high, and then go up with them into the green cloud over your head, and vanish as if a giant had thrown a ship's cable into the tree-tops. One of them, so grand that its form strikes even the Negro and the Indian, is Eliantas. You see that at once by the form of its cable, 6 or 8 inches across in one direction and 3 or 4 in another, furbelowed all down the middle into regular knots, and looking like a chain cable between 2 flexible iron bars. At another of the loops, about as thick as your arm, your companion, if you have a forester with you, will spring joyfully. With a few blows of his cutlass, he will sever it as high up as he can reach, and again below, some 3 feet down, and while you are wondering at this seemingly wanton destruction, he lifts the bar on high, throws his head back, and pours down his thirsty throat a pint or more of pure cold water. This hidden treasure is, strange as it may seem, the ascending sap, or rather the ascending pure rainwater which has been taken up by the roots and is hurrying aloft to be elaborated into sap and leaf and flower and fruit and fresh tissue for the very stem up which it originally climbed. And therefore it is that the woodman cuts the water vine through first at the top of the piece which he wants, and not at the bottom. For so rapid is the ascent of the sap that if he cut the stem below, the water would have all fled upwards before he could cut it off above. Meanwhile, the old story of Jack and the Beanstalk comes to your mind. In such a forest was the old dame's hut, and up such a beanstalk Jack climbed, to find a giant and a castle high above. And why not? What may not be up there? You look up into the green cloud and long for a moment to be a monkey. There may be monkeys up there over your head, burly red howler or tiny peevish Sappajoe, peering down at you, but you cannot peer up at them. The monkeys and the parrots and the humming birds and the flowers and all the beauty are upstairs, up above the green cloud. You are in the empty nave of the cathedral, and the service is being celebrated aloft in the blazing roof. We will hope that as you look up, you have not been careless enough to walk on, for if you have, you will be tripped up at once, nor to put your hand out incautiously to rest it against a tree or what not, for fear of sharp thorns, ants, and wasps' nests. If you are all safe, your next steps, probably as you struggle through the bush between the tree trunks of every possible size, will bring you face to face with huge upright walls of seeming boards, whose rounded edges slope upward till, as your eye follows them, you will find them enter an enormous stem, perhaps round, like one of the Norman pillars of Durham nave, and just as huge, perhaps fluted like one of William of Wykeham's columns at Winchester. There's the stem, but where's the tree? Above the green cloud. You struggle up to it between two of the broad walls, but find it not so easy to reach. Between you and it are 6 tough strings, which you had not noticed at first. The eye cannot focus itself rapidly enough in this confusion of distances, which have to be cut through ere you can pass. Some of them are rooted in the ground, straight and tense. Some of them dangle and wave in the wind at every height. What are they? Air roots of wild pines, or of matapalos, or figs, or seguines, or of some other parasite? Probably, but you cannot see. All you can see is, as you put your chin close against the trunk of the tree and look up, as if you were looking up against the side of a great ship set on end, that some 60 or 80 feet up in the green cloud, arms as big as English forest trees branch off, and that out of their forks a whole green garden of vegetation has tumbled down 20 or 30 feet and half climbed up again. You scramble around the tree to find whence this aerial garden has sprung. You cannot tell. The tree trunk is smooth and free from climbers, and that mass of verdure may belong possibly to the very cables which you meet ascending into the green cloud 20 or 30 yards back, or to that impenetrable tangle a dozen yards on, which has climbed a small tree, and then a taller one again, and then a taller still, till it has climbed out of sight, and possibly into the lower branches of the big tree. And what are their species? What are their families? Who knows? Not even the most experienced woodman or botanist can tell you the names of plants of which he only sees the stems. The leaves, the flowers, the fruit, can only be examined by felling the tree, and not even always then, for sometimes the tree, when cut, refuses to fall, linked as it is by chains of liane to all the trees around. Even that wonderful water vine which we cut through just now may be one of 3 or even 4 different plants. Soon you will be struck by the variety of the vegetation, and will recollect what you have often heard, that social plants are rare in the tropic forests. Certainly they are in the Trinidad, where the only instances of social trees are the moras, which I have never seen growing wild, and the Maurice palms. In Europe, a forest is usually made up of one dominant plant, of firs or of pines, of oaks or beeches, of birch or of heather. Here no two plants seem alike. There are more species on an acre here than in all the New Forest, Savernake or Sherwood. Stems rough, smooth, prickly, round, fluted, stilted, upright, sloping, branched, arched, jointed, opposite-leaved, alternate-leaved, leafless or covered with leaves of every conceivable pattern, are jumbled together till the eye and brain are tired of continually asking, what next? The stems are of every color, copper, pink, gray, green, brown, black as if burnt, marbled with lichens, many of them silvery white, gleaming afar in the bush, furred with mosses and delicate creeping film ferns, or laced with air roots of some parasite aloft. Up this stem scrambles a climbing seguin with entire leaves. Up the next another quite different with deeply cut leaves. Up the next the ceramon spreads its huge leaves latticed and forked again and again. So fast do they grow that they have not time to fill up the spaces between their nerves, and are consequently full of oval holes. And so fast does its spadix of flowers expand, that, as do some other aeroids, an actual genial heat and fire of passion, which may be tested by the thermometer or even by hand, is given off during fructification. Beware of breaking it, or the seguins. They will probably give off an evil smell, and as probably a blistering milk. Look on at the next stem. Up it and down again, a climbing fern which is often seen in hothouses has tangled its finely cut fronds. Up the next, a quite different fern is crawling, by pressing tightly to the rough bark its creeping root stalks, furred like a hare's leg. Up the next, the prim little griffchat plant has walked, by numberless clusters of small cat's claws which lay hold of the bark. And what is this delicious scent about the air? Vanille? Of course it is, and up that stem zigzags the green fleshy chain of the vanille orchis. The scented pod is far above, out of your reach, but not out of reach of the next parrot or monkey or negro hunter who winds the treasure. And the stems themselves, to what trees do they belong? It would be absurd for one to try to tell you, who cannot tell 1/20th of them himself. Suffice it to say that over your head are perhaps a dozen kinds of admirable timber, which might be turned to 100 uses in Europe, were it possible to get them thither. Your guide, who here will be a second hospitable and cultivated Scot, will point with pride to one column after another, straight as those of a cathedral, and 60 to 80 feet without branch or knob. That, he will say, is fiddlewood, that a carapo, that a cedar, that a robel oak, that, larger than all you have seen yet, a locust, that a puy, that a guatacaire, that an olivier, woods which he will tell you are all but incorruptible, defying weather and insects. He will show you as curiosities the smaller but intensely hard letter wood, lignum vitae, and purple heart. He will pass by as useless weeds, cebus and sandbox trees, whose bulk appalls you. He will look up, with something like a malediction, at the matapalos, which every 50 yards have seized on mighty trees, and are enjoying, I presume, every different stage of the strangling art, from the baby matapalo, who, like the one which you saw in the Botanic Garden, has let down his first air root along his victim's stem, to the old sinner whose dark crown of leaves is supported 80 feet in the air on innumerable branching columns of every size, cross-clasped to each other by transverse bars. The giant tree on which his seed first fell has rotted away utterly, and he stands in its place, prospering in his wickedness, like certain folk whom David knew too well. Your guide walks on with a sneer. But he stops with a smile of satisfaction as he sees, lying on the ground, dark green glossy leaves, which are fading into a bright crimson. For overhead somewhere there must be a balata, the king of the forest, and there, close by, is his stem, a madder brown column whose head may be 150 feet or more aloft. The forester pats the side of his favorite tree as a breeder might that of his favorite racehorse. He goes on to evince his affection, in the fashion of West Indians, by giving it a chop with his cutlass, but not in wantonness. He wishes to show you the hidden virtues of this, in his eyes, noblest of trees. How there issues out swiftly from the wound a flow of thick white milk, which will congeal in an hour's time into a gum intermediate in its properties between caoutchouc and gutta percha. Of a time when the English gutta percha market shall be supplied from the balatas of the northern hills, which cannot be shipped away as timber. He tells you how the tree is a tree of a generous, virtuous, and elaborate race, a tree of God, which is full of sap, as one said of old of such, and what could he say better, less or more? For it is a sapota, cousin to the sapodilla and other excellent fruit trees, itself most excellent even in its fruit-bearing power. For every 5 years it is covered with such a crop of delicious plums that the lazy Negro thinks it worth his while to spend days of hard work, besides incurring the penalty of the law, for the trees are government property, in cutting it down for the sake of its fruit. But this tree your guide will cut himself. There is no gully between it and the government station, and he can carry it away, and it is worth his while to do so, for it will square, he thinks, into a log more than 3 feet in diameter, and 80, 90, he hopes almost 100 feet in length of hard, heavy wood, incorruptible, save in salt water, better than oak, as good as teak, and only surpassed in this island by the puhi. He will make a stage round it some 8 feet high, and cut it above the spurs. It will take his convict gang, for convicts are turned to some real use in Trinidad, several days to get it down, and many more days to square it with the axe. A trace must be made to it through the wood, clearing away vegetation for which a European millionaire, could he keep it in his park, would gladly pay £100 a yard. The cleared stems, especially those of the palms, must be cut into rollers, and the dragging of the huge log over them will be a work of weeks, especially in the wet season. But it can be done, and it shall be. So he leaves a significant mark on his new-found treasure, and leads you on through the bush, hewing his way with light strokes right and left, so carelessly that you are inclined to beg him to hold his hand, and not destroy in a moment things so beautiful, so curious, things which would be invaluable in an English hothouse. And where are the famous orchids? They perch on every bough and stem, but they are not, with 3 or 4 exceptions, in flower in the winter, and if they were, I know nothing about them. At least, I know enough to know how little I know. Whosoever has read Darwin's Fertilization of Orchids, and finds in his own reason that the book is true, had best say nothing about the beautiful monsters till he has seen with his own eyes more than his master. And yet even the 3 or 4 that are in flower are worth going many a mile to see. In the hothouse they seem almost artificial from their strangeness, but to see them natural on natural boughs gives a sense of their reality, which no unnatural situation can give. Even to look up at them, perched on bough and stem as one rides by, and to guess what exquisite and fantastic form may issue, in a few months or weeks, out of those fleshy, often unsightly leaves, is a strange pleasure. A spur to the fancy which is surely wholesome, if we will but believe that all these things were invented by a fancy, which desires to call out in us, by contemplating them, such small fancy as we possess, and to make us poets, each according to this power, by showing a world in which, if rightly looked at, all is poetry. Another fact that will soon force itself on your attention, unless you wish to tumble down and get wet up to your knees. The soil is furrowed everywhere by holes, by graves, some 2 or 3 feet wide and deep, and of uncertain length and shape, often wandering about for 30 or 40 feet and running confusedly into each other. They are not the work of man, nor of an animal, for no earth seems to have been thrown out of them. In the bottom of the dry graves you sometimes see a decaying root, but most of them, just now, are full of water and of tiny fish, also, who burrow in the mud and sleep during the dry season, to come out and swim during the wet. These graves are, some of them, plainly quite new. Some, again, are very old, for trees of all sizes are growing in them and over them. What makes them? A question not easily answered. But the shrewdest foresters say that they have the roots of trees now dead. Either the tree has fallen and torn its roots out of the ground, or the roots and stumps have rotted in their place, and the soil above them has fallen in. But they must decay very quickly, these roots, to leave their quite fresh graves thus empty, and, now one thinks of it, how few fallen trees or even dead sticks there are about. An English wood, if left to itself, would be cumbered with fallen timber, and one has heard of forests in North America through which it is all but impossible to make way, so high are piled up among the still growing trees dead logs in every stage of decay. Such a sight may be seen in Europe, among the high silver fir forests of the Pyrenees. How is it not so here? How indeed? And how comes it, if you will look again, that there are few or no fallen trees, and actually no leaf mold? In an English wood there would be a foot, perhaps 2 feet, of black soil, renewed every autumn leaf fall. 2 feet! One has heard often enough of bison hunting in Himalayan forests among deodoras 150 feet high, and scarlet rhododendrons 30 feet high, growing in 15 or 20 feet of leaf and timber mold. And here, in a forest equally ancient, every plant is growing out of the bare yellow loam, as it might in a well-hoed garden bed. Is it not strange? Most strange, till you remember where you are, in one of nature's hottest and dampest laboratories. Nearly 80 inches of yearly rain and more than 80 degrees of perpetual heat make swift work with vegetable fiber, which in our cold and sluggard clime would curdle into leaf mold, perhaps into peat. Far to the north, in poor old Ireland, and far to the south, in Patagonia, begin the zones of peat, where dead vegetable fiber, its treasures of light and heat locked up, lies all but useless, age after age. But this is the zone of illimitable sun force, which destroys as swiftly as it generates, and generates again as swiftly as it destroys. Here, when the forest giant falls, as some tell me that they have heard him fall, on silent nights, when the cracking of the roots below the lianes aloft rattles like musketry through the woods, till the great trunk comes down with a boom as of a heavy gun, re-echoing on from mountainside to mountainside, then nothing in him that doth fade, but doth suffer an air change into something rich and strange. Under the genial rain and genial heat, the timber tree itself, all its tangled ruin of lianes and parasites, and the boughs and leaves snapped off not only by the blow, but by the very wind of the falling tree, all melt away swiftly and peacefully in a few months, say almost a few days, into the water and carbonic acid and sunlight out of which they were created at first, to be absorbed instantly by the green leaves around and transmuted into fresh forms of beauty, leave not a rack behind. Explained thus, and this I believe to be the true explanation, the absence of leaf mold is one of the grandest, as it is one of the most startling phenomena of the forest. Look here at a fresh wonder. Away in front of us a smooth gray pillar glistens on high. You can see neither the top nor the bottom of it. But its color and its perfectly cylindrical shape tell you what it is. A glorious palmiste. One of those queens of the forest which you saw standing in the fields, with its capital buried in the green cloud and its base buried in that bank of green velvet plumes, which you must skirt carefully round, for they are prickly dwarf palm, called black roseau. Close to it rises another pillar, as straight and smooth, but 1/4 of the diameter, a giant's walking cane. Its head, too, is in the green cloud. But near are 2 or 3 younger ones, only 40 or 50 feet high, and you see their delicate feather heads, and are told that they are monarchs, the slender nymphs, which attend upon the forest queen, as beautiful, though not as grand, as she. The land slopes down fast now. You are tramping through stiff mud, and those roseaux are a sound of water. There is a stream or gully near, and now, for the first time, you can see clear sunshine through the stems, and see, too, something of the bank of foliage on the other side of the brook. You can catch sight, it may be, of the head of a tree aloft, blazing with golden trumpet flowers, which is a pui, and of another low one covered with hoarfrost, perhaps a croton, and of another, a giant covered with purple tassels. That is an angelem. Another giant overtops even him. His dark glossy leaves toss off sheets of silver light as they flicker in the breeze, for it blows hard aloft outside while you are in the stifling calm. That is a balata. And what is that on high? 20 or 30 square yards of rich crimson 100 feet above the ground. The flowers may belong to the tree itself. It may be mountain mangrove, which I have never seen in flower, but take the glasses and decide. No, the flowers belong to a lian. The wonderful Prince of Wales feather has taken possession of the head of a huge mumbin, and tiled it all over with crimson combs which crawl out to the ends of the branches and dangle 20 or 30 feet down, waving and leaping in the breeze. And all over blazes the cloudless blue. You gaze astounded. 10 steps downward, and the vision is gone. The green cloud has closed again over your head, and you are stumbling in the darkness of the bush, half blinded by the sudden change from the blaze to the shade. Beware. "Take care of the croque-chien," shouts your companion, and you are aware of, not a foot from your face, a long green curved whip armed with pairs of barbs some 4 inches apart, and you are aware also at that same moment that another has seized you by the arm, another by the knees, and that you must back out unless you are willing to part with your clothes and your flesh afterwards. You back out, and find that you have walked into the tips, luckily only into the tips, of the fern-like fronds of a trailing and climbing palm such as you see in the botanic gardens. That came from the east and furnishes the rattan canes. This furnishes the gris-gris canes, and is rather worse to meet, if possible, than the rattan. Your companion, while he helps you to pick the barbs out, calls the palm laughingly by another name, suelta mi inglés, and tells you the old story of the Spanish soldier at San Josef. You are near the water now, for here is a thicket of beliciae. Push through under their great plantain-like leaves, slip down the muddy bank to that patch of gravel. See first, though, that it is not tenanted already by a deadly mapier or rattlesnake, which has not the grace, as his cousin in North America has, to use his rattle. The brooklet, muddy with last night's rain, is dammed and bridged by winding roots, in the shape like the jointed wooden snakes which we used to play with as children. They belong probably to a fig, whose trunk is somewhere up in the green cloud. Sit down on one, and look around and aloft. From the soil to the sky, which peeps through here and there, the air is packed with green leaves of every imaginable hue and shape. Round our feet are arums, with snow-white spadixes and hoods, one instance among many here of brilliant color developing itself in deep shade. But is the darkness of the forest actually as great as it seems? Or are our eyes, accustomed to the blaze outside, unable to expand rapidly enough, and so liable to mistake for darkness, air really full of light reflected downwards again and again at every angle from the glossy surfaces of 1,000,000 of leaves? At least we may be excused, for a bat has made the same mistake and flits past us at noonday. And there is another. No, as it turns, a blaze of metallic azure off the upper side of the wings proves this one to be no bat, but a morpho, a moth as big as a bat. And what was that second larger flash of golden green, which dashed at the moth and back to yonder branch not 10 feet off? A jacamar, kingfisher, as they miscall her here, sitting fearless of man, with the moth in her long beak. Her throat is snowy white, her underparts rich red-brown. Her breast and all her upper plumage and long tail glitter with golden green. There is light enough in this darkness, it seems. But now look again at the plants. Among the white-flowered arums are other arums, stalked and spotted, of which beware, for they are the poisonous seguin diable, the dumb cane, of which evil tales were told in the days of slavery. A few drops of its milk, put into the mouth of a refractory slave, or again into the food of a cruel master, could cause swelling, choking, and burning agony for many hours. Over our heads bend the great arrow leaves and purple leaf stalks of the tanias, and mingled with them leaves often larger still, oval, glossy, bright, ribbed, reflecting from their underside a silver light. They belong to aromas, and from their ribs are woven the Indian baskets and packs. Above these, again, the balisiers bend their long leaves 8 or 10 feet long apiece, and under the shade of the leaves, their gay flower spikes, like double rows of orange and blackbirds' beaks upside down. Above them, and among them, rise stiff upright shrubs with pairs of pointed leaves, a foot long, some of them, pale green above and yellow or fawn-colored beneath. You may see, by the 3 longitudinal nerves in each leaf, that they are melastomas of different kinds, a sure token that you are in the tropics, a probable token that you are in tropical America. And over them, and among them, what a strange variety of foliage. Look at the contrast between the balisier and that branch which has thrust itself among them, which you take for a dark copper-colored fern, so finely divided are its glossy leaves. It is really a mimosa bois mulâtre, as they call it here. What a contrast again, the huge feathery fronds of the cocorite palms, which stretch right away hither over our heads, 20 and 30 feet in length. And what is that spot of crimson flame hanging in the darkest spot of all from an under bough of that low weeping tree? A flower head of the Rosa del Monte. And what that bright straw-colored fox's brush above it, with a brown hood like that of an arum, brush and hood nigh 3 feet long each? Look, for you require to look more than once, sometimes more than once, here up the stem of that cocorite, or as much of it as you can see in the thicket. It is all jagged with the brown butts of its old fallen leaves, and among the butts perch broad-leafed ferns and fleshy orchids, and above them, just below the plume of mighty fronds, the yellow fox's brush, which is its spathe of flower. What next? Above the cocorites dangle, amid a dozen different kinds of leaves, festoons of a liane, or of 2, for one has purple flowers, the other yellow. Bignonias, bauhinias, what not? And through them a carrot palm has thrust its thin bending stem and spread out its flat head of fan-shaped leaves 20 feet long each, while over it, I verily believe, hangs 80 feet aloft the head of the very tree upon whose roots we are sitting. For amid the green cloud you may see sprigs of leaf somewhat like that of a weeping willow, and there probably is the trunk to which they belong, or rather what will be a trunk at last. At present it is like a number of round-edged boards of every size set on end, and slowly coalescing at their edges. There is a slit down the middle of the trunk 20 or 30 feet long. You may see the green light of the forest shining through it. Yes, that's probably the fig, or if not, then something else. For who am I, that I should know the 100th part of the forms on which we look? And above all you catch a glimpse of that crimson mass of Norantia which we admired just now, and black as you against the blue sky and white cloud, the plumes of one palmiste, who has climbed towards the light, it may be for centuries, through the green cloud, and now, weary and yet triumphant, rests her dark head among the bright foliage of a ceiba, and feeds unhindered on the sun. There, take your tired eyes down again, and turn them right or left or where you will, to see the same scene and yet never the same. New forms, new combinations, wealth of creative genius, let us use the wise old word in its true sense, incomprehensible by the human intellect or the human eye, even as He is who makes it all, whose garment, or rather whose speech, it is. The eye is not filled with seeing, or the ear with hearing, and never would be, did you roam these forests for 100 years. How many years would you need merely to examine and discriminate the different species? And when you had done that, how many more to learn their action and reaction on each other? How many more to answer that perhaps ever unanswerable question, how they exist and grow at all? By what miracle they are compacted out of light, air, and water, each after its own kind? How, again, those kinds began to be, and what were they like at first? Whether those crowded, struggling, competing shapes are stable or variable, whether or not they are varying still, whether even now as we sit here the great God may not be creating, slowly but surely, new forms of beauty around us. And why not? If He chose to do it, could He not do it? And even had you answered that question, which would require whole centuries of observation as patient and accurate as that which Mr. Darwin employed on orchids and climbing plants, how much nearer would you be to the deepest question of all? Do these things exist, or only appear? Are they solid realities, or mere phantasmagoria, orderly indeed and law-ruled, but a phantasmagoria still, a picture book by which God speaks to rational essences created in His own likeness? And even had you solved that old problem, and decided for Berkeley or against him, you would still have to learn from these forests a knowledge which enters into man not through the head, but through the heart, which, let some modern philosophers say what they will, defies all analysis, and can be no more defined or explained by words than a mother's love. I mean the causes and effects of their beauty, that aesthetic of plants, of which Schleiden has spoken so well in that charming book of his, The Plant, which all should read who wish to know somewhat of the open secret. But when they read it, let them read with open hearts. For that same open secret is, I suspect, one of those which God may hide from the wise and prudent, and yet reveal to babes. At least so it seemed to me, the first day that I went, awe-struck, into the high woods, and so it seemed to me the last day that I came, even more awestruck, out of them. End of section 43. Read by Tom Shoesmith, Menlo Park, California, April 16th, 2024.
Section 44 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Helen. Greatest Wonders of the World. Edited by Esther Singleton. The Yosemite Valley, United States. C.F. Gordon-Cumming. The valley can be approached from several different points. That by which we entered is, I think, known as Inspiration Point. When we started from Clark's Ranch, we were there then at about the same level as we are at this moment, namely 4,000 feet above the sea. The road gradually wound upwards through beautiful forest and by upland valleys, where the snow still lay pure and white, and here and there, where it had melted and exposed patches of dry earth, the red, flame-like blossoms of the snow plant gleamed vividly. It was slow work toiling up those steep ascents, and it must have taken us much longer than our landlord had expected, for he had dispatched us without a morsel of luncheon, and ere we reached the halfway house, where we were forced to change horses, we were all ravenous, a dozen hungry people with appetites sharpened by the keen, exhilarating mountain air. No provisions of any sort were to be had, but the compassionate horsekeeper, hearing our pitiful complaints, produced a loaf and a pot of blackberry jelly, and we all sat down on a bank and ate our piece, as the bairns in Scotland would say, with infinite relish, and drank from a clear stream close by. So we were satisfied with bread here in the wilderness. I confess to many qualms as to how that good fellow fared himself, as loaves cannot grow abundantly in those parts. Once more we started on our toilsome way across mountain meadows and forest ridges, till at last we had gained a height of about 7,000 feet above the sea. Then suddenly we caught sight of the valley lying about 3,000 feet below us, an abrupt chasm in the great rolling expanse of billowy granite ridges, or should I rather describe it as a vast sunken pit with perpendicular walls and carpeted with a level meadow through which flows a river gleaming like quicksilver. Here and there a vertical cloud of spray on the face of the huge crags told where some snow-fed stream from the upper levels had found its way to the brink of the chasm, a perpendicular fall from 2,000 to 3,000 feet. The fall nearest to where we stood, yet at a distance of 7 miles, was pointed out as the Bridal Veil. It seemed a floating film of fine mist on which played the loveliest rainbow lights, for the sun was already lowering behind us, though the light shone clear and bright on the cold white granite crags and on the glittering snow peaks of the high Sierras. Each mighty precipice and rock needle and strange granite dome was pointed out to us by name as we halted on the summit of the pass ere commencing the steep descent. The Bridal Veil falls over a granite crag near the entrance of the valley, which, on the opposite side, is guarded by a stupendous square-cut granite mass, projecting so far as seemingly to block the way. These form the gateway of this wonderful granite prison. Perhaps the great mass of cliff rather suggests the idea of a huge keep wherein the genii of the valley braved the siege of the ice giants. The Indians revere it as the great chief of the valley, but white men only know it as El Capitan. If it must have a new title, I think it should at least rank as a field marshal in the rock world, for assuredly no other crag exists that can compare with it. Just try to realize its dimensions, a massive face of smooth cream-coloured granite, 1/2 mile long, 1/2 mile wide, 3/5 of a mile high. Its actual height is 3,300 feet. I think that 5,280 feet go to a mile. Think of our beautiful Castle Rock in Edinburgh, with its 434 feet, or Dover Castle, 469 feet, or even Arthur's Seat, 822 feet. What pygmies they would seem, could some wizard transport them to the base of this grand crag, on whose surface not a blade of grass, nor a fern or a lichen finds holding ground, or presumes to tinge the bare, clean-cut precipice, which, strange to tell, is clearly visible from the great San Joaquin Valley, a distance of 60 miles. Imagine a crag just the height of Snowdon, with a lovely snow stream falling perpendicularly from its summit to its base, and a second and larger fall in the deep gorge where it meets the rock wall of the valley. The first is nameless, and will vanish with the snows, but the second never dries up, even in summer. It is known to the Indians as Long-U-Tu-Kuya, which describes its graceful length, but white men call it the Virgin's Tears or the Ribbon Fall, a blending of millinery and romance doubtless devised by the same genius who changed the Indian name of the Pohono to the Bridal Veil. We passed close to the latter as we entered the valley, in fact, forded the stream just below the fall, and agreed that if Pohono be in truth, as the Indian legend tells, the spirit of an evil wind, it surely must be a repentant, glorified spirit, for nothing so beautiful could be evil. It is a sight to gladden the angels, a most ethereal fall, light as steam, swaying with every breath. It falls from an overhanging rock, and often the current produced by its own rushing seems to pass beneath the rock, and so checks the whole column, and carries it upwards in a wreath of whitest vapour, blending with the true clouds. When the rainbow plays on it, it too seems to be wafted up, and floats in a jewelled spray, wherein sapphires and diamonds and opals, topaz and emeralds all mingle their dazzling tints. At other times it rushes down in a shower of fairy-like rockets in what appears to be a perpendicular column, 1,000 feet high, and loses itself in a cloud of mist among the tall dark pines which clothe the base of the crag. A very accurate gentleman has just assured me that it is not literally perpendicular, as, after a leap of 630 feet, it strikes the rock, and then makes a fresh start in a series of almost vertical cascades, which form a dozen streamlets ere they reach the meadows. He adds that the fall is about 50 feet wide at the summit. The rock mass over which it falls forms the other great granite portal of the valley, not quite so imposing as its massive neighbour, but far more shapely. In fact, it bears so strong a resemblance to a Gothic building that it is called the Cathedral Rock. It is a cathedral for the giants, being 2,660 feet in height, and two graceful rock pinnacles attached to the main rock, and known as the cathedral spires, are each 500 feet in height. Beyond these towers a truly imposing rock needle, which has been well named the Sentinel. It is an obelisk 1,000 feet in height, rising from the great rock wall, which forms a pedestal of 2,000 more. As if to balance these three rock needles on the right-hand side, there are on the left three rounded mountains, which the Indians call Pompomasus, that is, the leaping frog rocks. They rise in steps, forming a triple mountain 3,630 feet high. Tall frogs these, even for California. Imaginative people say the resemblance is unmistakable, and that all the frogs are poised as if in readiness for a spring, with their heads all turned the same way. For my own part, I have a happy knack of not seeing these accidental likenesses, and especially those faces and pictures, generally grotesque, which some most aggravating people are always discovering among the lines and weather stains on the solemn crags, and which they insist on pointing out to their unfortunate companions. Our coachman seemed to consider this a necessary part of his office, so I assume there must be some people who like it. Farther up the valley, two gigantic domes of white granite are built upon the foundation of the great encompassing wall. One stands on each side of the valley. The north dome is perfect, like the roof of some vast mosque, but the south, or half-dome, is an extraordinary freak of nature, very puzzling to geologists, as literally half of the stupendous mass of granite has disappeared, leaving no trace of its existence, save a sheer, precipitous rock face, considerably over 4,000 feet in height, from which the corresponding half has evidently broken off and slipped down into some fearful chasm, which apparently it has been the means of filling up. Above the domes and closing in the upper end of the valley is a beautiful snow mountain called Cloud's Rest, which, seen from afar, is the most attractive point of all, and one which I must certainly visit some day. But meanwhile there are nearer points of infinite interest, the foremost being the waterfall from which the valley takes its name, and which burst suddenly upon our amazed vision when we reached the base of the Sentinel Rock. It is so indescribably lovely that I altogether despair of conveying any notion of it in words, so shall not try to do so yet awhile. But from what I have told you, you must perceive that each step in this strange valley affords a study for weeks, whether to an artist, a geologist, or any other lover of beautiful and wonderful scenes, and more than ever I congratulate myself on having arrived here while all the oaks, alders, willows, and other deciduous trees are bare and leafless, so that no curtain of dense foliage conceals the countless beauties of the valley. I already have seen innumerable most beautiful views, scarcely veiled by the filmy network of twigs, but evidently will be altogether concealed a month hence, when these have donned their summer dress. To me, these leafless trees rank with fires and snows. I have not seen one since I left England, so I look to them with renewed interest, and delight in the beauty of their anatomy, as you and I have done many a time in the larch woods and the birk and braes of the Findorn, where the yellow twigs of the larch and the grey aspen and claret-coloured sprays of birch blend with russet oak and green Scotch firs, and produce a winter colouring well nigh as varied as that of summer. Here there is an enchanting reminder of home in the tall poplar trees, the balm of Gilead, which are just bursting into leaf, and fill the air with heavenly perfume. They grow in clumps all along the course of the Merced, the beautiful river of mercy, which flows through this green level valley so peacefully as if it was thankful for this quiet interval in the course of its restless life. There is no snow in the valley, but it still lies thickly on the hills all around. Very soon it will melt, and then the falls will all be in their glory, and the meadows will be flooded and the streams impassable. I am glad we have arrived in time to wander about dry-footed and to learn about the geography of the country in its normal state. The valley is an almost dead level, about 8 miles long, and varies in width from half a mile to 2 miles. It is like a beautiful park of greenest sward, through which winds the clear, calm river, a capital trout stream of about 80 feet in width. In every direction are scattered picturesque groups of magnificent trees, noble old oaks and pines of 250 feet in height. The river is spanned by 2 wooden bridges, and 3 neat hotels are well placed in the middle of the valley, half a mile apart. Happily not fine, incongruous buildings, but wooden bungalows well suited to the requirements of such pilgrims as ourselves. May Day, 1877. May Day! What a vision of lang syne, of the May dew we used to gather from off the cowslips by the sweet burn side in those dear old days, when we were all young together, and when the earth was new to me. I dare say you forgot all about May Day this morning, in the prosaic details of town life. But here we ran no such risk, for we had determined to watch the Beltane sunrise, reflected in the glacis of Mountain Tarns, known as the Mirror Lake, and as it lies about 3 miles from here, in one of the upper forks of the valley, we had to astir betimes. So when the stars began to pale in the eastern sky, we were astir, and with the earliest ray of dawn set off like true pilgrims bound to drink of some holy spring on May morning. For the first 2 miles our path lay across quiet meadows, which as yet are only sprinkled with blossom. We found no cowslips, but watched our faces in the Californian May-dew, which we brushed from the fresh young grass and ferns. Soon, they tell me, there will be violets, cowslips, and primroses. We passed by the orchard of the first settler in the valley. His peach and cherry trees were laden with pink and white blossoms, his strawberry beds likewise promising an abundant crop. It was a morning of calm beauty, and the massive grey crags all around the valley lay like sleeping kings, robed in purple gloom, while the pale yellow light crept behind them, tall pines forming a belt of deeper hue around their base. About 2 miles above the great Yo-semité Falls, the valley divides into 3 branches, canyons I should say, or more correctly, canyons. The central one is the main branch, through which the Merced itself descends from the high Sierras, passing through the little Yosemite Valley, and thence rushing down deep gorges and leaping 2 precipices of 700 and 400 feet, which form the Nevada and the Vernal Falls, and so entering the Great Valley, where for 8 miles it finds rest. The canyon which diverges to the right is that down which rushes the south fork of the Merced, which bears the musical though modern name of the Île Illuette. It rises at the base of Mount Star King and enters the valley by the graceful falls which bear this pretty name. At the point where we left the main valley to turn into the Tenaya Fork, the rock wall forms a sharp angle, ending in a huge columnar mass of very white granite, 2,400 feet in height. The Indians call it Junto, which means one who keeps watch, but the white men call it Washington Column. Beside it, the rock wall has taken the form of gigantic arches. The lower rock seems to have weakened and crumbled or split off in huge flakes, while the upper portions remain, overhanging considerably and forming regularly arched cliffs 2,000 feet in height. I cannot think how it has happened that in so republican a community these mighty rocks should be known as the Royal Arches, unless from some covert belief that they are undermined and liable to topple over. Their original name is Tokoyoi, which describes the arched hood of an Indian baby's cradle, a famous nursery for giants. The perpendicular rock face beneath the arches is a sheer, smooth surface, yet seamed with deep cracks as though it would fall, were it not for the mighty buttresses of solid rock which project for some distance, casting deep shadows across the cliff. As a test of size, I noticed a tiny pine growing from a crevice in the rock face, and on comparing it with another in a more accessible position, I found that it really was a very large, well-grown tree. Just as this season, when the snows on the Sierras are beginning to melt, 1,000 crystal streams find temporary channels along the high levels until they reach the smooth verge of the crags, and thence leap in white foam, forming temporary falls of exceeding beauty. 3 such graceful falls at present overleap the mighty arches, and in their turn produce pools and exquisitely clear streams, which thread their devious way through woods and meadows, seeking the river of mercy. So the air is musical with the lullaby of hidden waters, and the murmur of the unseen river rippling over its pebbly bed. Turning to the right, we next ascend Tenaya Valley, which is beautifully wooded, chiefly with pine and oak, and strewn with the loveliest mossy boulders. Unfortunately, the number of rattlesnakes is rather a drawback to perfect enjoyment here. I have so long been accustomed to our perfect immunity from all manner of noxious creatures in the blessed South Sea Isles that I find it difficult at first to recall my wonted caution and to gang warily. However, today we saw no evil creatures, only a multitude of the jolliest little chipmunks, which are small grey squirrels of extreme activity. They are very tame and dance about the trees close to us, jerking their brush and giving the funniest little skips and sometimes fairly chattering to us. Beyond this wood we found the Mirror Lake. It is a small pool, but exquisitely cradled in the very midst of stern granite giants, which stand all around as sentinels, guarding its placid sleep. Willows, already covered with downy tufts, are now just bursting into slender leaflets, fringe its shores, and tall cedars and pines overshadow its waters, and are therein reflected in the stillness of the early dawn, when even the granite crags far overhead also find themselves mirrored in the calm lakelet. But with the dawn comes a whispering breeze, and just as the sun's first gleam kisses the waters, the illusion vanishes, and there remains only a somewhat muddy and troubled pool. It lies just at the base of that extraordinary half-dome of which I told you yesterday, a gigantic crest of granite which rises above the lake almost precipitously to a height of 4,737 feet. Only think of it, nearly a mile! Of this, the upper 2,000 feet is a sheer face of granite crag, absolutely vertical except that the extreme summit actually projects somewhat. Otherwise, it is as clean cut as if the mighty dome had been cloven with a sword. A few dark streaks near the summit, due, I believe, to a microscopic fungus or lichen, alone relieve the unbroken expanse of glistening, creamy white. The lower half slopes at a very slight incline, and is likewise a solid mass of granite, not made up of broken fragments, of which there are a wonderfully small proportion anywhere in the valley. So the inference is that in the tremendous convulsion this mighty chasm was created. The great south dome was split from the base to the summit, and that half of it slid down into the yawning gulf. Thus the gently rounded base between the precipice of the lake was doubtless originally the summit of the missing half-mountain. I believe that geologists are now satisfied that this strange valley, with its clean-cut vertical walls, was produced by what is called in geology a fault, namely, that some of the earth's ribs, having given away internally, a portion of the outer crust has subsided, leaving an unoccupied space. That such was the case in Yo-semité is proved by much scientific reasoning. It is shown that the two sides of the valley in no way correspond, so the idea of a mere gigantic fissure cannot be entertained. Besides, as the valley is as wide at the base as at the summit, the vertical walls must have moved apart bodily, a theory which would involve a movement of the whole chain of the Sierras for a distance of half a mile. There is not a trace of any glacier having passed through the valley, so that the ice giants have had no share in making it. Neither can it have been excavated by the long-continued action of rushing torrents, such as have carved great canyons in many parts of the Sierra Nevada. These never have vertical walls, and besides, the smoothest faces of granite in Yo-semité are turned towards the lower end of the valley, proving at once that they were never produced by forces moving downwards. So it is simply supposed that a strip of the Sierras caved in, and that in time the melting snows and streams formed a great deep lake which filled up the whole space now occupied by the valley. In the course of ages the debris of the hills continually falling into the lake must have filled up the chasm to a level with the canyon, which is the present outlet from the valley, and as the glaciers on the upper Sierras disappeared and the water supply grew less, the lake must have gradually dried up, and that in comparatively recent times, and its bed of white granite sand, mingled with vegetable mould, was transformed into a green meadow through which the quiet river now glides peacefully. This evening the sun set in a flood of crimson and gold, such a glorious glow as would have dazzled an eagle. It paled to a soft primrose, then ethereal green. Later, the pearly-grey clouds were rose-flushed by an afterglow more vivid than the sunset itself, a rich, full carmine, which quickly faded away to the cold, intense blue of a Californian night. It was inexpressibly lovely. Then the fitful wind rose in gusts, a melancholy, moaning wail, vibrating among rocks, forest, and waters, and a low, surging sound, a wild mountain melody. No wonder the Indians reverence the beautiful Yosemite Falls. Even the white settlers in the valley cannot resist their influence, but speak of them with an admiration that amounts to love. Some of them have spent the winter here, and seem almost to have enjoyed it. They say that if I could see the falls in their winter robes, all fringed with icicles, I should gain a glimpse of fairyland. At the base of the great fall, the fairies build a real ice palace, something more than 100 feet high. It is formed by the ever-falling, freezing spray, and the bright sun gleams on this glittering palace of crystal, and the falling water striking upon it shoots off in showers like myriad opals and diamonds. Now scarcely an icicle remains, and the falls are in their glory. I had never dreamt of anything so lovely. Here we stand in the glorious sunlight, among pine trees a couple of 100 feet in height, and they are pygmies like ourselves in the presence of even the lowest step of the stately fall, which leaps and dashes from so vast a height that it loses all semblance of water. It is a splendid bouquet of glistening rockets, which instead of rushing heavenward, shoot down as if from the blue canopy, which seems to touch the brink nearly 2,700 feet above us. Like myriad falling stars they flash, each keeping its separate course for several 100 feet, till at length it blends with 10,000 more in the grand avalanche of frothy, fleecy foam, which forever and forever falls, boiling and raging like a whirlpool, among the black boulders in the deep cauldron below, and throwing back clouds of mist and vapour. The most exquisite moment occurs when you reach some spot where the sun's rays, streaming past you, transform the light vapour into brilliant rainbow prisms, which gird the falls with vivid iris bars. As the water rockets flash through these radiant belts, they seem to carry the colour onward as they fall, and sometimes it wavers and trembles in the breeze, so that the rainbow knows not where to rest, but forms a moving column of radiant tricolour. So large a body of water rushing through the air naturally produces a strong current, which passing between the face of the rock and the fall, carries the latter well forward, so that it becomes the sport of every breeze that dances through the valley. Hence this great column is forever vibrating from side to side, and it often forms a semicircular curve. The width of the stream at the summit is about 20 to 30 feet, but at the base of the upper fall it has expanded to a width of fully 300 feet, and as the wind carries it to one side or the other, it plays over a space of fully 1,000 feet in width, over a precipitous rock face 1,600 feet in depth. That is the height of the upper fall. As seen from below, the Yo-semité, though divided into 3 distinct falls, is apparently all on one plane. It is only when you reach some point from which you see it sideways that you realize that the upper fall lies a fully quarter of a mile further back than the middle and lower falls, and that it rushes down this space in boiling cascades till it reaches a perpendicular rock, over which it leaps about 600 feet, and then gives a third and final plunge of about 500, making up a total of a little under 2,700 feet. When we came to the head of the valley, whence diverged the 3 rocky canyons, we bade adieu to the green meadows, and passing up a most exquisite gorge, crossed the Ile Illuette by a wooden bridge, and followed the main fork of the Merced up the central canyon. I do not anywhere know a lovelier mile of river scenery than on this tumultuous rushing stream, leaping from rock to rock, sweeping across mossy boulders, and falling in crystalline cascades, the whole fringed with glittering icicles and overshadowed by tall pine trees, whose feathery branches fringe the steep cliffs and wave in the breeze. Presently, a loud roar of falling water told us that we were nearing the vernal falls, and through a frame of dark pines we caught a glimpse of the white spirit-like spray cloud. Tying up my pony, we crept to the foot of the falls, whence a steep flight of wooden steps have been constructed, by which a pedestrian can ascend about 400 feet to the summit, and thence resume his way, thus saving a very long way round. But of course, 4-footed creatures must be content to go by the mountain, and so the pony settled our route, greatly to our advantage, for the view thence, looking down the canyon and across to Glacier Point, proved to be about the finest thing we had seen, as an effect of mountain gloom. Just above the vernal falls comes a reach of the river known as the Diamond Race, a stream so rapid and so glittering that it seems like a shower of sparkling crystals, each drop a separate gem. I have never seen a race which, for speed and dazzling light, could compare with these musical glancing waters. For half a mile above it, the river is a tumultuous raging flood, rushing at headlong speed down a boulder-strewn channel. At the most beautiful point it is crossed by a light wooden bridge, and on the green mountain meadow just beyond stands the wooden house, to which a kindly landlord gave us a cheery, hearty welcome. Here, the lullaby for the weary is the ceaseless roar of the mighty Nevada Falls, which come thundering down the cliffs in a sheer leap of 700 feet, losing themselves in a deep rock pool, fringed with tall pines, which loom ghostly and solemn to the ever-floating, tremulous mists of fine spray. It is a fall so beautiful as fairly to divide one's allegiance to Yo-semité, especially as we first beheld it to about 3 in the afternoon, when the western rays of the lowering sun lightened up dark firs with a golden glow, and dim rainbows played on the spray clouds. It was as if fairy weavers had woven borders of purple and blue, green and gold, orange and delicate rose colour, on a tissue of silvery gauze, and each dewy drop that rested on the fir needles caught the glorious light and became a separate prism, as though the trees were sprinkled with liquid radiant gems. Anything more wonderful than the beauty of the diamond race in the evening lights I never dreamt of. It is like a river in the fairy tale, all turned to spray, jewelled, glittering spray, rubies, diamonds, and emeralds, all dancing and glancing in the sunlight. Just below this comes a little reach of the smoothest, clearest water, which seems to calm and collect itself ere gliding over the edge of a great square-hewn mass of granite 400 feet deep, forming the vernal falls. Along the summit of this rock there runs a very remarkable natural ledge about 4 feet in height, so exactly like the stone parapet of a Cyclopean rampart that it is scarcely possible to believe it is not artificial. Here you can lean safely within a few feet of the fall, looking straight down the perpendicular crag. But for this ledge it would be dangerous even to set foot on that smooth, polished rock, which is as slippery as ice. Early rising here is no exertion, and it brings its own reward, for there is an indiscernible charm in the early gloaming as it steals over the Sierras, a freshness and exquisite purity of atmosphere which thrills through one's being like a breath of the life celestial. If you would enjoy it to perfection, you must steal out alone ere the glory of the starlight has paled, as I did this morning, following a devious pathway between thickets of azalea whose heavenly fragrance perfumed the valley. Then, ascending a steep track through the pine forest, I reached a bald grey crag, commanding a glorious view of the valley, and some of the high peaks beyond, and thence I watched the coming of dawn. A pale daffodil light crept upwards, and the stars faded from heaven. Then the great ghostly granite domes changed from deep purple to a cold dead white, and the far distant snow-capped peaks stood out in a glittering light, while silvery grey mists floated upward from the canyons, as if awakening from their sleep. Here, just as in our own highlands, a faint chill breath of some cold current invariably heralds the daybreak, and the tremulous leaves quiver, and a whisper greeting to the dawn. Suddenly, a faint flash of rosy light just tinged the higher snow peaks, and gradually stealing downwards, overspread range beyond. Another moment, and the granite domes and the great rock sentinel alike blazed in the fiery glow, which deepened in colour till all the higher crags seemed aflame, while the valley still lay shrouded in purple gloom, and a great and solemn stillness brooded over all. Granite Crags, Edinburgh and London, 1884. End of section 44.
Section 45 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Tom Shoesmith. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. Section 45, The Golden Horn. Turkey, by Alphonse de Lamartine. The land breeze begins to rise, and we make use of it to approach nearer and nearer to the Dardanelles. Already several large ships, which like us are trying to make this difficult entrance, come near us. Their large grey sails, like the wings of night birds, glide silently between our brig and Tenedos. I go down below and fall asleep. Break of day. I hear the rapid sailing of vessels and the little morning waves that sound around the sides of the brig like the song of birds. I open the porthole, and I see on a chain of low and rounded hills the castles of the Dardanelles, with their white walls, their towers, and their immense mouths for the cannon. The canal is scarcely more than a league in width at this place. It winds like a beautiful river between the exactly similar coasts of Asia and Europe. The castles shut in this sea just like the two wings of a door. But in the present condition of Turkey and Europe, it would be easy to force a passage by sea, or to make a landing and take the forts from the rear. The passage of the Dardanelles is not impregnable, unless guarded by the Russians. The rapid current carries us on like an arrow. Before Gallipoli and the villages bordering the canal, we see the isles in the Sea of Marmara frowning before us. We follow the coast of Europe for 2 days and 2 nights, thwarted by the north winds. In the morning we perceive perfectly the Isles of the Princes in the Sea of Marmara and the Gulf of Nicaea, and on our left the Castle of the 7 Towers, and the aerial tops of the innumerable minarets of Stamboul, in front of the 7 hills of Constantinople. At each tack we discover something new. At the first view of Constantinople I experienced a painful emotion of surprise and disillusion. What? Is this, I asked myself, the sea, the shore, and the marvelous city for which the masters of the world abandoned Rome and the coast of Naples? Is this that capital of the universe, seated upon Europe and Asia, for which all the conquering nations disputed by turns as the sign of the supremacy of the world? Is this the city that painters and poets imagine queen of cities, seated upon her hills and her twin seas, enclosed by her gulfs, her towers, her mountains, and containing all the treasures of nature and the luxury of the Orient? It is here that one makes comparison with the Bay of Naples, bearing its white city upon its hollowed bosom like a vast amphitheatre, with Vesuvius losing its golden brow in the clouds of smoke and purple lights, the forest of Castellamare plunging its black foliage into the blue sea, and the islands of Procida and Ischia with their volcanic peaks, yellow with vine branches and white with villas, shutting in the immense bay like gigantic moles thrown up by God himself at the entrance of this port. I see nothing here to compare to that spectacle with which my eyes are always enchanted. I am sailing, it is true, upon a beautiful and lovely sea, but from the low coasts rounded and monotonous hills rear themselves. It is true that the snows of Olympus of Thrace whiten the horizon, but they are only a white cloud in the sky and do not make the landscape solemn enough. At the back of the gulf I see nothing but the same rounded hills of the same height, without rocks, without coves, without indentations, and Constantinople, which the pilot points out with his finger, is nothing but a white and circumscribed city upon a large knoll on the European coast. Is it worth while having come so far to be disenchanted? I did not wish to look at it any longer. However, the ceaseless tackings of the ship brought us sensibly nearer. We coasted along the Castle of the 7 Towers, an immense medieval grey block, severe in construction, which faces the sea at the angle of the Greek walls of the ancient Byzantium, and we came to anchor beneath the houses of Stamboul, in the Sea of Marmara, in the midst of a host of ships and boats delayed like ourselves from port by the violence of the north winds. It was 5 o'clock. The sky was serene and the sun brilliant. I began to recover from my disdain of Constantinople. The walls that enclosed this portion of the city, picturesquely built of the débris of ancient walls, and surmounted by gardens, kiosks, and little houses of wood painted red, formed the foreground of the picture. Above, the terraces of numerous houses rose in pyramid-like tiers, story upon story, cut across with the tops of orange trees and the sharp black spires of cypress. Higher still, 7 or 8 large mosques crowned the hill, and, flanked by their open-work minarets and their Moresque colonnades, lifted into the sky their gilded domes flaming with the palpitating sunlight. The walls painted with tender blue, the leaden covers of the cupolas that encircled them, gave them the appearance and the transparent glaze of monuments of porcelain. The immemorial cypresses lend to these domes their motionless and sombre peaks, and the various tints of the painted houses of the city make the vast hill gay with all the colors of a flower garden. No noise issues from the streets, no lattice of the innumerable windows opens, no movement disturbs the habitation of such a great multitude of men. Everything seems to be sleeping under the broiling sunlight. The gulf, furrowed in every direction with sails of all forms and sizes, alone gives signs of life. Every moment we see vessels in full sail clear the Golden Horn, the opening of the Bosphorus, the true harbor of Constantinople, passing by us flying towards the Dardanelles, but we cannot perceive the entrance of the Bosphorus, nor even understand its position. We dine on the deck opposite this magical spectacle. Turkish cakes come to question us and bring us provisions and food. The boatmen tell us that there is no longer any plague. I send my letters to the city. At 7 o'clock, Monsieur Turquie, the Consul General of Sardinia, accompanied by officers of his legation, comes to pay us a visit, and offer us the hospitality of his house in Pera. There is not the slightest hope of finding a lodging in the recently burned city. The obliging cordiality and the attraction that Monsieur Turquie inspires at the first moment induces us to accept. The contrary wind still blows, and the brigs cannot raise anchor this evening. We sleep on board. At 5 o'clock I am standing on the deck. The captain lowers a boat. I descend with him, and we set sail towards the mouth of the Bosphorus, coasting along the walls of Constantinople, which the sea washes. After half an hour's navigation through a multitude of ships at anchor, we reach the walls of the Seraglio, which stands next to those of the city, and form, at the extremity of the hill that bears Stamboul, the angle that separates the Sea of Marmara from the canal of the Bosphorus and the Golden Horn, or the grand inner roadstead of Constantinople. It is here that God and man, nature and art, have placed or created in concert the most marvelous view that human eyes may contemplate upon the earth. I gave an involuntary cry, and I forgot forever the Bay of Naples and all its enchantments. To compare anything to this magnificent and gracious combination would be to insult creation. The walls supporting the circular terraces of the immense gardens of the great Seraglio were a few feet from us to our left, separated from the sea by a narrow sidewalk of stone flags, washed by the ceaseless billows, where the perpetual current of the Bosphorus formed little murmuring waves as blue as those of the Rhone at Geneva. These terraces, that rise in gentle inclines up to the Sultan's palace, where you perceive the gilded domes across the gigantic tops of the plantain trees and the cypresses, are themselves planted with enormous cypresses and plantains, whose trunks dominate the walls and whose boughs, spreading beyond the garden, hang over the sea in cascades of foliage, shadowing the cakes. The rowers stop from time to time beneath their shade. Every now and then these groups of trees are interrupted by palaces, pavilions, kiosks, doors sculptured and gilded opening upon the sea, or batteries of cannon of copper and bronze in ancient and peculiar shapes. Several pulls of the oar brought us to the precise point of the Golden Horn, where you enjoy at once a view of the Bosphorus, the Sea of Marmara, and, finally, of the entire harbor, or rather the inland sea of Constantinople. There we forgot Marmara, the coast of Asia, and the Bosphorus, taking in with one glance the basin of the Golden Horn and the 7 cities seated upon the 7 hills of Constantinople, all converging towards the arm of the sea that forms the unique and incomparable city, that is at the same time city, country, sea, harbor, bank of flowers, gardens, wooded mountains, deep valleys, an ocean of houses, a swarm of ships and streets, tranquil lakes and enchanted solitudes, a view that no brush can render except by details, and where each stroke of the oar gives the eye and soul contradictory aspects and impressions. We set sail towards the hills of Galata and Pera. The seraglio receded from us and grew larger in receding in proportion as the eye embraced more and more the vast outlines of its walls and the multitude of its roofs, its trees, its kiosks, and its palaces. Of itself it is sufficient to constitute a large city. The harbor hollows itself out more and more before us. It winds like a canal between the flanks of the curved mountains and increases as we advance. The harbor does not resemble a harbor in the least. It is rather a large river like the Thames, enclosing the two coasts of the hills laden with towns, and covered from one bank to the other with an interminable flotilla of ships, variously grouped the entire length of the houses. We pass by this innumerable multitude of boats, some riding at anchor, and some about to set sail, sailing before the wind toward the Bosphorus, towards the Black Sea, or towards the Sea of Marmara, boats of all shapes and sizes and flags, from the Arabian bark whose prow springs and rises like the beak of antique galleys, to the vessel of 3 decks with its glittering walls of bronze. Some flocks of Turkish caiques, managed by 1 or 2 rowers in silken sleeves, little boats that serve as carriages in the maritime streets of this ambitious town, circulate between the large masses, cross and knock against each other without overturning, and jostle one another like a crowd in public places. And clouds of gulls, like beautiful white pigeons, rise from the sea at their approach, to travel further away and be rocked upon the waves. I did not try to count the vessels, the ships, the brigs, the boats of all kinds, and the barks that slept or traveled in the harbor of Constantinople, from the mouth of the Bosporus and the point of the Seraglio to Ayoub and the delicious valleys of sweet waters. The Thames at London offers nothing in comparison. It will suffice to say that independently of the Turkish flotilla and the European men of war at anchor in the center of the canal, the 2 sides of the Golden Horn are covered 2 or 3 vessels deep for about a mile in length. We could only see the ocean by looking between the file of prows, and our glance lost itself at the back of the gulf, which contracted and ran into the shore amid a veritable forest of masts. I have just been strolling along the Asian shore on my return this evening to Constantinople, and I find it 1,000 times more beautiful than the European shore. The Asian shore owes almost nothing to man. Everything here has been accomplished by nature. Here there is no Buyukdere, no Therapia, no palace of ambassadors, and no town of Armenians or Franks. There are only mountains, gorges that separate them, little valleys carpeted with meadows that seem to dig themselves out of the rocks, rivulets that wind about them, cascades that whiten them with their foam, forests that hang to their flanks, glide into their ravines, and descend to the very edges of the innumerable coast gulfs. A variety of forms and tints and of leafy verdure, which the brush of a landscape painter could not even hope to suggest. Some isolated houses of sailors or Turkish gardeners are scattered at great distances on the shore, or thrown upon the foreground of a wooded hill, or grouped upon the point of rocks where the current carries you and breaks into waves as blue as the night sky. Some white sails of fishermen, who creep along the deep coves, which you see glide from one plane tree to another like linen that the washerwomen fold. Innumerable flights of white birds that dry themselves on the edge of the meadows, eagles that hover among the heights of the mountains near the sea, mysterious creeks entirely shut in between rocks and trunks of gigantic trees, whose boughs, overcharged with leaves, bend over the waves and form upon the sea cradles wherein the caiques creep. 1 or 2 villages hidden in the shadow of these creeks, with their gardens behind them on those green slopes, and their group of trees at the foot of the rocks, with their barks rocked by the gentle waves before their doors, their clouds of doves on the roofs, their women and children at the windows, their old men seated beneath the plane trees at the foot of the minaret. laborers returning from the fields in their cakes, others who have filled their barks with green faggots, myrtle, or flowering heath to dry it for fuel in the winter. Hidden behind these heaps of slanting verdure that border and descend into the water, you perceive neither the bark nor the rower, and you believe that a portion of the bank, detached from the earth by the current, is floating at haphazard on the sea with its green foliage and perfumed flowers. The shore presents this same appearance as far as the castle of Mahomet II, which from this coast also seems to shut in the Bosphorus like a Swiss lake. There it changes its character. The hills, less rugged, sink their flanks and more gently hollow into narrow valleys. The Asiatic villages extend more richly and nearer together. The sweet waters of Asia, a charming little plain shadowed by trees and sown with kiosks and Moorish fountains, opens out to the vision. Beyond the palace of Bayard, the Asian coast again becomes wooded and solitary, as far as Scutari, which is as brilliant as a garden of roses at the extremity of a cape at the entrance of the Sea of Marmara. Opposite, the verdant point of the Seraglio presents itself to the eye, and between the European coast, crowned with its 3 painted towns, and the coast of Stamboul, all glittering with its cupolas and minarets, opens the immense port of Constantinople, where the ships anchored at the 2 banks leave only one large waterway for the caiques. I glide through this labyrinth of buildings, as in a Venetian gondola under the shadow of palaces, and I land at the Échelle des Morts, under an avenue of cypresses. Voyage en Orient, Paris, 1843. End of section 45.
Section 46 of Greatest Wonders of the World. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Quartertone. Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton. The Yellowstone, by Rudyard Kipling. That desolate land and lone, where the Bighorn and Yellowstone roar down their mountain path. Twice I have written this letter from end to end. Twice I have torn it up, fearing lest those across the water should say that I had gone mad on a sudden. Now we will begin for the 3rd time, quite solemnly and soberly. I have been through the Yellowstone National Park in a buggy, in the company of an adventurous old lady from Chicago and her husband, who disapproved of scenery as being ungodly. I fancy it scared them. We began, as you know, with the Mammoth Hot Springs. They are only a gigantic edition of those pink and white terraces not long ago destroyed by earthquake in New Zealand. At one end of the little valley in which the hotel stands, the lime-laden springs that break from the pine-covered hillsides have formed a frozen cataract of white, lemon, and palest pink formations, through and over and in which water of the warmest bubbles and drips and trickles from pale green lagoon to exquisitely fretted basin. The ground rings hollow as a kerosene tin, and someday the Mammoth Hotel, guests and all, will sink into the caverns below and be turned into a stalactite. When I set foot on the first of the terraces, a tourist-trampled ramp of scabby gray stuff, I met a steam of iron red-hot water which ducked into a hole like a rabbit. Followed a gentle chuckle of laughter, and then a deep, exhausted sigh from nowhere in particular. 50 feet above my head, a jet of steam rose up and died out in the blue. It was worse than the boiling mountain at Mayanoshta. The dirty white deposit gave place to lime whiter than snow. And I found a basin which some learned hotel keeper has christened Cleopatra's Pitcher, or Mark Antony's whiskey jug, or something equally poetical. It was made of frosted silver. It was filled with water as clear as the sky. I do not know the depth of that wonder. The eye looked down beyond grottos and caves of beryl into an abyss that communicated directly with the central fires of earth. And the pool was in pain, so that it could not refrain from talking about it, muttering and chattering and moaning. From the lips of the lime ledges, 40 feet under water, spurts of silver bubbles would fly up and break the piece of the crystal atop. Then the whole pool would shake and grow dim, and there were noises. I removed myself only to find other pools, all equally unhappy, rifts in the ground, full of running red-hot water, slippery sheets of deposit overlaid with greenish-gray hot water, and here and there pit-holes dry as a rifled tomb in India, dusty and waterless. Elsewhere the infernal waters had first boiled dead and then embalmed the palms and underwood, or the forest trees had taken heart and smothered up a blind formation with greenery, so that it was only by scraping the earth you could tell what fires had raged beneath. Yet the pines will win the battle in years to come, because nature, who first forges all her work in her great smithies, has nearly finished this job and is ready to temper it in the soft brown earth. The fires are dying down. The hotel is built where terraces have overflowed into flat wastes of deposit. The pines have taken possession of the high ground whence the terraces first started. Only the actual curve of the cataract stands clear, and it is guarded by soldiers who patrol it with loaded six-shooters in order that the tourist may not bring up fence rails and sink them in a pool, or chip the fretted tracery of the formations with a geological hammer, or, walking where the crust is too thin, foolishly cook himself. Next dawning, entering a buggy of fragile construction with the old people from Chicago, I embarked on my perilous career. We ran straight up a mountain till we could see 60 miles away, the white houses of Cook City on another mountain, and the whiplash-like trail leading thereto. The live air made me drunk. If Tom, the driver, had proposed to send the mares in a bee-line to the city, I should have assented, and so would the old lady who chewed gum and talked about her symptoms. The tub-ended rock dog, which is but the translated prairie dog, broke across the road under our horses' feet. The rabbit and the chipmunk danced with fright. We heard the roar of the river, and the road went round a corner. On one side piled rock and shale that enjoined silence for fear of a general slide-down. On the other a sheer drop, and a fool of a noisy river below. Then, apparently in the middle of the road, lest any should find driving too easy, a post of rock. Nothing beyond that, save the flank of a cliff. Then my stomach departed from me, as it does when you swing, for we left the dirt, which was at least some guarantee of safety, and sailed out round the curve and up a steep incline on a plank road built out from the cliff. The planks were nailed at the outer edge, and did not shift or creak very much, but enough, quite enough. That was the Golden Gate. I got my stomach back again when we trotted out onto a vast upland adorned with a lake and hills. Have you ever seen an untouched land, the face of virgin nature? It is rather a curious sight, because the hills are choked with timber that has never known an axe, and the storm has rent a way through this timber, so that 100,000 trees lie matted together in swaths. And since each tree lies where it falls, you may behold trunk and branch returning to the earth whence they sprang, exactly as the body of a man returns, each limb making its own little grave, the grass climbing above the bark, till at last there remains only the outline of a tree upon the rank undergrowth. Then we drove under a cliff of obsidian, which is black glass, some 200 feet high, and the road at its foot was made of black glass that crackled. This was no great matter, because half an hour before, Tom had pulled up in the woods that we might sufficiently admire a mountain who stood all by himself, shaking with laughter or rage. Then, by companies after tiffin, we walked chattering to the uplands of hell. They call it the Norris Geysir Basin on earth. It was as though the tide of dissolution had gone out, but would presently return across innumerable acres of dazzling white geyser formation. There were no terraces here, but all other horrors. Not 10 yards from the road, a blast of steam shot up, roaring every few seconds. A mud volcano spat filth to heaven. Streams of hot water rumbled underfoot, plunged through the dead pines in steaming cataracts, and died on a waste of white, where green-gray, black-yellow, and link pools roared, shouted, bubbled, or hissed, as their wicked fancies prompted. By the look of the eye, the place should have been frozen over. by the feel of the feet, it was warm. I ventured out among the pools, carefully following tracks, but one unwary foot began to sink, a squirt of water followed, and having no desire to descend quick into Tophet, I returned to the shore where the mud and the sulphur and the nameless fat ooze vegetation of Lethe lay. But the very road rang as though built over a gulf, and besides, how was I to tell when the raving blast of steam would find its vent insufficient and blow the whole affair into nirvana? There was a potent stench of stale eggs everywhere, and the crystals of sulphur crumbled under the foot, and the glare of the sun on the white stuff was blinding. We curved the hill and entered a forest of spruce, the path serpentining between the tree boles, the wheels running silent on immemorial mould. There was nothing alive in the forest save ourselves. Only a river was speaking angrily somewhere to the right. For miles we drove, till Tom bade us alight and look at certain falls. Wherefore we stepped out to that forest, and nearly fell down a cliff which guarded a tumbled river and returned demanding fresh miracles. If the water had run uphill, we should perhaps have taken more notice of it. But 'twas only a waterfall, and I really forget whether the water was warm or cold. There is a stream here called Firehole River. It is fed by the overflow from the various geysers and basins, a warm and deadly river wherein no fish breed. I think we crossed it a few dozen times in the course of the day. Then the sun began to sink, and there was a taste of frost about, and we went swiftly from the forest into the open, dashed across a branch of the Firehole River, and found a wood shanty, even rougher than the last, at which, after a 40-mile drive, we were to dine and sleep. Half a mile from this place stood, on the banks of the Firehole River, a beaver lodge, and there were rumors of bears and other cheerful monsters in the woods on the hill at the back of the building. Once upon a time there was a carter who brought his team and a friend into the Yellowstone Park without due thought. Presently they came upon a few of the natural beauties of the place, and that carter turned his friend's team, howling, "Get back of this, Tim! All hell's alight under our noses!" And they call the place Hell's Half Acre to this day. We too, the old lady from Chicago, her husband, Tom, and the good little mares, came to Hell's Half Acre, which is about 60 acres. And when Tom said, "Would you like to drive over it?" we said, "Certainly no, and if you do, we shall report you to the authorities." There was a plain, blistered and puled and abominable, and it was given over to the sportings and spoutings of devils who threw mud and steam and dirt at each other with whoops and halloos and bellowing curses. The place smelt of the refuse of the pit, and that odor mixed with the clean, wholesome aroma of the pines in our nostrils throughout the day. Be it known that the park is laid out, like Ollendorf, in exercises of progressive difficulty. Hell's Half Acre was a prelude to 10 or 12 miles of geyser formation. We passed hot streams boiling in the forest, saw whiffs of steam beyond those, and yet other whiffs breaking through the misty green hills in the far distance. We trampled on sulphur and sniffed things much worse than any sulphur which is known to the upper world, and so came upon a park-like place where Tom suggested we should get out and play with the geysers. Imagine mighty green fields splattered with lime beds, all the flowers of the summer growing up to the very edge of the lime. That was the first glimpse of the geyser basins. The buggy had pulled up close to a rough, broken, blistered cone of stuff between 10 and 20 feet high. There was trouble in that place, moaning, splashing, gurgling, and the clank of machinery. A spurt of boiling water jumped into the air, and a wash of water followed. I removed swiftly. The old lady from Chicago shrieked. "What a wicked waste," said her husband. I think they call it the Riverside Geyser. Its spout was torn and ragged like the mouth of a gun where a shell had burst there. It grumbled madly for a moment or two, and then was still. I crept over the steaming lime, it was the burning marl on which Satan lay, and looked fearfully down its mouth. You should never look a gift geyser in the mouth. I beheld a horrible, slippery, slimy funnel with water rising and falling 10 feet at a time. Then the water rose to lip level with a rush, and an infernal bubbling troubled this devil's Bethesda before the sullen heave of the crest of a wave lapped over the edge and made me run. Mark the nature of the human soul. I had begun with awe, not to say terror. I stepped back from the flanks of the riverside geyser, saying, "Pooh! Is that all it can do?" Yet for aught I knew, the whole thing might have blown up at a minute's notice, she, he, or it being an arrangement of uncertain temper. We drifted up on that miraculous valley. On either side of us were hills from 1,000 to 15 feet high and wooded from heel to crest. As far as the eye could range forward were columns of steam in the air, misshapen lumps of lime, most like preadamite monsters, still pools of turquoise blue, stretches of blue cornflowers, a river that coiled on itself 20 times, boulders of strange colors, and ridges of glaring, staring white. The old lady from Chicago poked with her parasol at the pools as though they had been alive. On one particularly innocent-looking little puddle she turned her back for a moment, and there rose behind her a 20-foot column of water and steam. Then she shrieked and protested that she never thought it would have done it, and the old man chewed his tobacco steadily and mourned for steam power wasted. I embraced the whitened stump of a middle-sized pine that had grown all too close to a hot pool's lip, and the whole thing turned over under my hand as a tree would do in a nightmare. From right and left came the trumpetings of elephants at play. I stepped into a pool of old dried blood rimmed with the nodding cornflowers. The blood changed to ink even as I trod, and the ink and blood were washed away in a spurt of boiling sulphurous water spat out from the lee of a bank of flowers. This sounds mad, doesn't it? We rounded a low spur of hills and came out upon a field of aching snowy lime, rolled in sheets, twisted into knots, riven with rents and diamonds and stars, stretching for more than half a mile in every direction. In this place of despair lay most of the big geysers, who know when there is trouble in Krakatoa, who tell the pines when there is a cyclone on the Atlantic seaboard, and who are exhibited to visitors under pretty and fanciful names. The first mound that I encountered belonged to a goblin splashing in his tub. I heard him kick, pull a shower bath on his shoulders, gasp, crack his joints, and rub himself down with a towel. Then he let the water out of the bath, as a thoughtful man should, and it all sank down out of sight till another goblin arrived. Yet they called this place the Lioness and the Cubs. It lies not very far from the lion, which is a sullen, roaring beast, and they say that when it is very active, the other geysers presently follow suit. After the Krakatoa eruption, all the geysers went mad together, spouting, spurting, and bellowing till men feared they would rip up the whole field. Mysterious sympathies exist among them, and when the giantess speaks, of her more anon, they all hold their peace. I was watching a solitary spring when, far across the fields, stood up a plume of spun glass, iridescent and superb against the sky. "That," said the trooper, "is Old Faithful. He goes off every 65 minutes to the minute, plays for 5 minutes, and sends up a column of water 150 feet high. By the time you have looked at all the other geysers, he will be ready to play." So we looked and we wondered at the beehive, whose mouth is built up exactly like a hive, at the turban, which is not in the least like a turban, and at many, many other geysers, hot holes, and springs. Some of them rumbled, some hissed, some went off spasmodically, and others lay still in sheets of sapphire and beryl. Would you believe that even these terrible creatures have to be guarded by troopers to prevent the irreverent American from chipping the cones to pieces, or worse still, making the geysers sick? If you take of soft soap a small barrelful and drop it down a geyser's mouth, that geyser will presently be forced to lay all before you, and for days afterwards it will be of an irritated and inconsistent stomach. When they told me the tale, I was filled with sympathy. Now I wish I had stolen soap and tried the experiment on some lonely little beast of a geyser in the woods. It sounds so probable and so human. Yet he would be a bold man who would administer emetics to the giantess. She is fat-lipped, having no mouth. She looks like a pool, 50 feet long and 30 wide, and there is no ornamentation about her. At irregular intervals she speaks, and sends up a column of water over 200 feet high to begin with. Then she is angry for a day and a half, sometimes for 2 days. Owing to her peculiarity of going mad in the night, not many people have seen the giantess at her finest. But the clamor of her unrest, men say, shakes the wooden hotel and echoes like thunder among the hills. When I saw her, trouble was brewing. The pool bubbled seriously, and at 5-minute intervals sank a foot or two, then rose, washed over the rim, and huge steam bubbles broke on the top. Just before an eruption, the water entirely disappears from view. Whenever you see the water die down in a geyser mouth, get away as fast as you can. I saw a tiny little geyser suck in its breath in this way, and instinct made me retire while it hooted after me. Leaving the giantess to swear and spit and thresh about, we went over to Old Faithful, who by reason of his faithfulness has benches close to him whence you may comfortably watch. At the appointed hour we heard the water flying up and down the mouth with the sob of waves in a cave. Then came the preliminary gouts, then a roar and a rush, and that glittering column of diamonds rose, quivered, stood still for a minute. Then it broke, and the rest was a confused snarl of water not 30 feet high. All the young ladies, not more than 20, in the tourist band remarked that it was elegant, and betook themselves to writing their names in the bottoms of shallow pools. Nature fixes the insult indelibly, and the after years will learn that Hattie, Sadie, Mamie, Sophie, and so forth have taken out their hairpins and scrawled in the face of Old Faithful. Next morning Tom drove us on, promising new wonders. He pulled up after a few miles at a clump of brushwood where an army was drowning. I could hear the sick gasps and thumps of the men going under, but when I broke through the brushwood the hosts had fled, and there were only pools of pink, black, and white lime, thick as turbid honey. They shot up a pat of mud every minute or two, choking in the effort. It was an uncanny sight. Do you wonder that in the old days the Indians were careful to avoid the Yellowstone? Geysers are permissible, but mud is terrifying. The old lady from Chicago took a piece of it, and in half an hour it died into lime dust and blew away between her fingers. All Maya, illusions, you see. Then we clinked over sulphur and crystals. There was a waterfall of boiling water, and a road across a level park hotly contested by the beavers. As we climbed the long path, the road grew viler and viler, till it became, without disguise, the bed of a torrent. And just when things were at their rockiest, we emerged into a little sapphire lake, but never sapphire was so blue, called Mary's Lake, and that between 8,000 and 9,000 feet above the sea. Then came grass downs, all on a vehement slope, so that the buggy following the new-made road ran on to the two off-wheels mostly, till we dipped headfirst into a ford, climbed up a cliff, raced along a down, dipped again, and pulled up disheveled at Larry's for lunch and an hour's rest. The sun was sinking when we heard the roar of falling water and came to a broad river along whose banks we ran. And then, oh, then! I might, at a pinch, describe the infernal regions, but not the other place. Be it known to you that the Yellowstone River has occasion to run through a gorge about 8 miles long. To get to the bottom of the gorge, it makes 2 leaps, one of about 120 and the other of 300 feet. I investigated the upper or lesser fall, which is close to the hotel. Up to that time, nothing particular happens to the Yellowstone, its banks being only rocky, rather steep, and plentifully adorned with pines. At the falls, it comes round a corner, green, solid, ribbed with a little foam, and not more than 30 yards wide. Then it goes over, still green, and rather more solid than before. After a minute or two, you, sitting on the rock directly above the drop, begin to understand that something has occurred, that the river has jumped a huge distance between the solid cliff walls, and what looks like the gentle froth of ripples lapping the sides of the gorge below is really the outcome of great waves. And the river yells aloud, but the cliffs do not allow the yells to escape. That inspection began with curiosity and finished in terror, for it seemed that the whole world was sliding in chrysolite from under my feet. I followed with the others round the corner to arrive at the brink of the canyon. We had to climb up a nearly perpendicular ascent to begin with, for the ground rises more than the river drops. Stately pine woods fringe either lip of the gorge, which is the Gorge of the Yellowstone. All I can say is that without warning or preparation, I looked into a gulf 1,700 feet deep with eagles and fish-hawks circling far below. And the sides of that gulf were one wild welter of color, crimson, emerald, cobalt, ochre, amber, honey, splashed with port wine, snow-white, vermilion, lemon, and silver gray in wide washes. The sides did not fall sheer, but were graven by time and water and air into monstrous heads of kings, dead chiefs, men and women of the old time. So far below that no sound of its strife could reach us, the Yellowstone River ran, a finger-wide strip of jade green. The sunlight took these wondrous walls and gave fresh hues to those that nature had already laid there. Once I saw the dawn break over a lake in Rajputana, and the sun set over Udi Sagar amid a circle of Holman Hunt hills. This time I was watching both performances go on below me, upside down, you understand, and the colors were real. The canyon was burning like Troy town, but it would not burn forever, and, thank goodness, neither pen nor brush could ever portray its splendors accurately. The Academy would reject the picture for a chromolithograph. The public would scoff at the letterpress for daily telegraphies. "I will leave this thing alone," said I. "'Tis my peculiar property. Nobody else shall share it with me." Evening crept through the pines that shadowed us, but the full glory of the day flamed in that canyon as we went out very cautiously to a jutting piece of rock, blood red or pink it was, that overhung the deepest deeps of all. Now I know what it is to sit enthroned amid the clouds of sunset. Giddiness took away all sensation of touch or form, but the sense of blinding color remained. When I reached the mainland again, I had sworn that I had been floating. From Sea to Sea, Letters of Travel, New York, 1899. End of section 46. End of Greatest Wonders of the World, edited by Esther Singleton.